Hello everyone and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. All right, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. On a quiet Sunday evening in October 2018, the Mariners Cove apartment complex in Tampa, Florida, seemed like any other peaceful residential neighborhood. Families were settling in for the night, children were finishing their homework, and the sound of televisions hummed softly through thin walls. But in one particular apartment, what should have been a simple evening at home was about to spiral into an unthinkable tragedy that would leave 2 innocent lives lost and a community forever changed. This is the story of Stephanie Willis, a 34-year-old mother trying to build a life for herself and her beloved 10-year-old son, Ricky. It's also the story of how the most ordinary moments can become the catalyst for extraordinary violence, and how a disagreement over something as mundane as a television channel could escalate into a double murder that would ultimately lead to Florida's death chamber. October 21st, 2018, started like any other Sunday for Stephanie Willis and her son Ricky, whose full name was Ricky Ryan Willis. The 34-year-old mother had been navigating the complexities of single parenthood while maintaining a relationship with 42-year-old Tyrone Johnson, a man who had become a regular presence in their home at the Mariners Cove apartment complex. Stephanie was the kind of mother who put her son first. Those who knew her described her as devoted, always ensuring that Ricky felt loved and secure despite the challenges they faced. 10-year-old Ricky was a typical boy, energetic, curious, and completely trusting of the adults in his life. He had no reason to believe that the man who had been dating his mother for months could ever pose a threat to him or to the woman he loved most in the world. The apartment was modest but comfortable, a place where Stephanie had worked hard to create stability for her son. The living room was arranged around a television set, the focal point where the small family would gather to watch shows together, sharing popcorn and creating the kind of simple memories that form the foundation of childhood. That evening, as darkness settled over Tampa, the three of them were in the living room. The television was on, and what happened next would demonstrate how quickly domestic tranquility can shatter when violence lurks just beneath the surface of seemingly normal relationships. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. According to Johnson's own account to police, he shot Stephanie Willis during their argument. The 34-year-old mother, who just moments before had been debating what television show to watch, was suddenly fighting for her life in her own living room. But the violence didn't end there. 10-year-old Ricky, hearing the commotion, came running toward the master bedroom. Imagine the confusion and terror this child must have felt. Hearing sounds he didn't understand, perhaps calling out for his mother, running toward what he thought was safety, but was actually the epicenter of unimaginable danger. According to Johnson's statement to investigators, when Ricky came running into the master bedroom, he was caught in the crossfire. This phrase, clinical and detached, barely begins to capture the horror of what actually occurred. The evidence that investigators would later uncover painted a much more sinister picture of Ricky's final moments. Crime scene analysis revealed a story that contradicted Johnson's claims of chaotic crossfire. Shell casings were found in strategic locations. Blood evidence told its own story. And most damning of all, investigators discovered bullet holes under Ricky's bed, along with the child's blood in the same location. The physical evidence suggested something far more deliberate and terrifying. That 10-year-old Ricky, in his final moments of life, had tried to hide under his bed. The crime scene indicated that Johnson had chased the frightened child into his bedroom, where Ricky had done what any scared child would do. He had crawled under his bed, seeking the kind of hiding place that children believe will keep them safe from monsters. But this time, the monster was real, and hiding wasn't enough. After the shooting stopped, after Stephanie Willis lay dead and her 10-year-old son had breathed his last breath under his own bed, Tyrone Johnson made a phone call. He dialed 911, the number that people call when they need help, when they need rescue, when they need someone to come and make things right. But Johnson wasn't calling for help for his victims. He was calling to report what he had done. The 911 call would become a crucial piece of evidence in the case against him. In that call, Johnson told authorities that he had shot Stephanie Willis and her 10-year-old son. His voice on the recording, the words he chose, the emotions he displayed or didn't display, would all become part of the prosecution's case against him. Emergency responders rushed to the Mariners Cove apartment complex, but there was nothing they could do for Stephanie and Ricky. The paramedics who arrived that night found two people who had been loved, who had plans for the next day, who had been watching television just hours before, now gone forever because of one man's inability to control his anger over something as trivial as a television channel. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office began their investigation immediately. Detectives arrived at the scene to find Johnson still present, and they began the meticulous work of documenting evidence and trying to understand exactly what had happened in that apartment. Johnson spoke to investigators that night, and his demeanor was telling. Those who interviewed him described him as hysterical as he recounted his version of events. He insisted that he had felt under attack by Stephanie, that he had acted in self-defense, that the shooting of young Ricky had been accidental, an unfortunate consequence of a chaotic situation. But as investigators began to process the crime scene, Johnson's story started to fall apart. The physical evidence didn't support his claims of self-defense or accidental shooting. Instead, it painted a picture of deliberate violence, of a man who had chosen to use lethal force not just against his girlfriend, but against a defenseless child. The shell casings, the blood spatter patterns, the bullet holes, each piece of evidence was like a word in a sentence that told the true story of what happened that night. And that story was far more damning than anything Johnson had admitted to. Forensic experts examined every inch of the crime scene. They mapped the locations where shots were fired, analyzed the trajectories of bullets, and documented the precise positions where Stephanie and Ricky had fallen. The evidence they gathered would prove crucial in contradicting Johnson's claims of self-defense and accidental shooting. The medical examiner's testimony would later reveal the true horror of what 10-year-old Ricky endured in his final moments. The autopsy showed that the child had suffered multiple gunshot wounds, not the single accidental shot that might be consistent with being caught in the crossfire, but multiple deliberate wounds. Even more chilling, the medical examiner testified that after several of the wounds were inflicted, Ricky would still have been able to move. This meant that the child had been shot, was wounded and terrified, and yet Johnson had continued to fire. The evidence suggested that Ricky had tried to escape, had crawled under his bed seeking safety, and Johnson had followed him there to continue the attack. The forensic evidence painted a picture of a child's desperate attempt to survive, to hide, to escape from an adult who should have been protecting him but instead had become his killer. The bullet holes under the bed, the blood evidence in that location, the shell casings, all of it told the story of a child's final, futile attempt to save his own life. On November 8, 2018, just weeks after the murders, a Hillsborough County grand jury returned an indictment against Tyrone Johnson. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Ricky Willis, both premeditated murder and felony murder. He was also charged with second-degree murder in the death of Stephanie Willis. The distinction in charges was significant. The first-degree murder charge for Ricky's death indicated that prosecutors believed Johnson had planned and deliberated the child's killing, or that it occurred during the commission of another felony. The second-degree murder charge for Stephanie suggested that while her killing was intentional, it may not have been premeditated in the same way. As the case moved through the court system, Johnson remained in custody. A judge denied his request for bail, determining that he posed too great a risk to the community. The evidence against him was substantial, and the nature of the crimes, particularly the murder of a child, made him an unsuitable candidate for pretrial release. The legal proceedings would take years to unfold. During this time, Stephanie and Ricky's family members struggled with their grief while waiting for justice. Robert Hewitt, Stephanie's father and Ricky's grandfather, would later be seen shaking in the courtroom as the case proceeded, a physical manifestation of the emotional toll that violent crime takes not just on direct victims, but on everyone who loved them. When the case finally went to trial in 2021, prosecutors faced the challenging task of proving that Johnson's actions constituted first-degree murder, particularly in the death of young Ricky. They had to demonstrate not just that Johnson had killed the child, but that he had done so with premeditation and deliberation. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the physical evidence from the crime scene. They presented the jury with the shell casings found throughout the apartment, the blood evidence that showed where each victim had been when they were shot, and the bullet holes that told the story of the violence that unfolded that night. Most damning was the evidence from under Ricky's bed. The prosecution argued that the presence of shell casings, blood, and bullet holes in that location proved that Johnson had deliberately pursued the frightened child to his hiding place and executed him there. This wasn't the accidental shooting of a child caught in crossfire, they argued, but the cold-blooded murder of a defenseless boy who was trying to save his own life. The prosecution also presented Johnson's own statements to police, in which he had admitted to the shootings while claiming self-defense. But his claims of feeling threatened didn't match the evidence of what actually happened, particularly the evidence that showed Ricky had been shot multiple times while hiding under his bed. Johnson's defense team faced an almost impossible task. The physical evidence clearly showed that their client had killed both Stephanie and Ricky Willis. Their only hope was to argue that the killings didn't constitute first-degree murder, that they were instead the result of a chaotic situation that had spiraled out of control. The defense focused on what they characterized as imperfections in the crime scene investigation. They argued that the evidence didn't clearly support the prosecution's timeline of events, and they urged the jury to consider lesser charges of manslaughter rather than murder. They painted a picture of Johnson as a man who had been pushed to his breaking point, who had acted in what he believed was self-defense, and who had never intended for the situation to escalate to violence. They acknowledged that he had killed Stephanie and Ricky, but they argued that his actions didn't rise to the level of premeditated murder. However, the defense had to contend with overwhelming physical evidence that contradicted their client's version of events. The evidence under Ricky's bed was particularly damaging to any claim that the child's death was accidental or unintentional. How do you accidentally chase a child to his hiding place and shoot him multiple times? After hearing all the evidence, reviewing the crime scene photographs, listening to expert testimony about bullet trajectories and blood spatter patterns, and considering Johnson's own statements about that night, the jury reached their verdict. They found Tyrone Johnson guilty as charged. The evidence had been too strong, the crime seemed too clear in its story, for them to accept the defense's arguments about manslaughter or accidental death. The jury concluded that Johnson had indeed committed first-degree murder in the death of Ricky Willis and second-degree murder in the death of Stephanie Willis. The verdict meant that Johnson now faced the possibility of execution. In Florida, first-degree murder can be punished by death, and the prosecution had indicated from the beginning that they would seek the ultimate penalty for the murder of 10-year-old Ricky. After the guilty verdict, the case moved to its penalty phase, where the same jury would decide whether Johnson should receive life in prison or death. This phase of the trial focused not just on the crimes themselves, but on Johnson's background, his character, and whether there were any mitigating factors that might justify sparing his life. The prosecution argued that the nature of the crimes, particularly the deliberate murder of a child who was hiding under his bed, warranted the death penalty. They emphasized the premeditated nature of Ricky's killing, the vulnerability of the victims, and the complete lack of justification for Johnson's actions. The defense, meanwhile, tried to present Johnson as a human being worthy of mercy. They likely presented evidence about his background, his military service, any mental health issues he might have struggled with, and argued that life in prison without the possibility of parole would be sufficient punishment for his crimes. But the jury had seen the crime scene photographs. They had heard the testimony about Ricky's final moments, about a 10-year-old child crawling under his bed for safety only to be pursued and killed there. They had learned about the multiple gunshot wounds, about the evidence that the child had still been alive and moving after some of the shots were fired. On November 17, 2021, after deliberating on Johnson's fate, the 12-member jury returned with their recommendation. Their decision was unanimous. Tyrone Johnson should be executed for the murder of Ricky Willis. The unanimity of their recommendation spoke volumes about how the jury viewed the evidence and Johnson's actions. In death penalty cases, unanimity is required, and achieving it means that 12 different people with 12 different backgrounds and perspectives all reached the same conclusion about the appropriate punishment for the crime. Robert Hewitt, Stephanie's father and Ricky's grandfather, was present in the courtroom when the recommendation was read. The family had previously stated their belief that Johnson deserved the death penalty, saying that prison was too good for him, and that he had murdered our daughter and grandson for absolutely no reason. The jury's recommendation wasn't binding. The final decision would rest with the judge, but it carried significant weight in the legal process. Judges rarely override unanimous jury recommendations in death penalty cases, particularly when the evidence is as clear and the crimes as heinous as those committed by Johnson. The formal sentencing hearing took place on December 12, 2022, more than 4 years after the murders and over a year after the jury's recommendation. Judge Christopher Sabella had reviewed all the evidence, considered the jury's unanimous recommendation, and weighed the factors that determine whether someone receives life in prison or death. When Johnson appeared before the judge for sentencing, he made one final plea for mercy. The man who had shown no mercy to a 10-year-old child hiding under his bed now begged for the mercy he had denied his victims. He asked the court to spare his life, to sentence him to life in prison instead of death. But Judge Sabella had heard all the evidence. He had seen the crime scene photographs, read the medical examiner's reports, and considered the testimony about Ricky's final moments. The judge concluded that Johnson's crimes warranted the ultimate penalty. Johnson received a death sentence for the first-degree murder of Ricky Willis and a life sentence for the second-degree murder of Stephanie Willis. The distinction in sentences reflected the jury and judge's conclusion that the child's murder was the more heinous crime, the deliberate killing of an innocent child who posed no threat to anyone. As is standard in death penalty cases, Johnson's conviction and sentence were automatically appealed to the Florida Supreme Court. His attorneys argued that errors had been made during his trial, that the evidence didn't support the first-degree murder conviction, and that the death sentence was inappropriate. The appeals process is lengthy and complex, designed to ensure that no one is wrongfully executed and that proper legal procedures were followed throughout the trial and sentencing phases. Johnson's case would join the long list of death penalty appeals working their way through Florida's court system. During the appeals process, Johnson remained on death row, housed in a maximum security facility with other condemned inmates. The appeals could take years or even decades to resolve, as courts carefully review every aspect of the case to ensure that justice was properly served. The murders of Stephanie and Ricky Willis fit into a broader pattern of domestic violence that claims thousands of lives each year across the United States. While most domestic disputes don't escalate to murder, the Willis case demonstrates how quickly intimate partner violence can turn fatal, particularly when children are present in the household. Domestic violence experts often point out that the most dangerous time for victims is when they attempt to leave their abusers or when abusers feel they are losing control of the situation. While the specific dynamics of Johnson and Stephanie's relationship weren't fully explored in court, the case shows how domestic violence can affect not just intimate partners, but also children who become victims simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The case also highlights the particular vulnerability of children in domestic violence situations. Ricky Willis was not the intended target of Johnson's initial anger, but he became a victim simply because he was present when violence erupted. His young age made him completely defenseless against an adult determined to cause harm. The murders sent shockwaves through the Tampa community and the residents of the Mariners Cove apartment complex. Neighbors who had seen Stephanie and Ricky around the complex, who had watched the boy play outside and had exchanged pleasantries with his mother, were forced to confront the reality that terrible violence had occurred just steps from their own homes. For the other families living in the complex, The murders served as a stark reminder of how domestic violence can spill over and affect entire communities. Children who had played with Ricky were now forced to grapple with his absence, while parents struggled to explain the inexplicable. How someone could hurt a child and his mother over something as simple as what to watch on television. The case also had a profound impact on law enforcement and court personnel who worked on it. Police officers who processed the crime scene, detectives who investigated the murders, attorneys who prosecuted the case, and court staff who facilitated the legal proceedings all had to confront the brutal reality of what Johnson had done to his victims. In the aftermath of the tragedy, it's important to remember Stephanie and Ricky Willis not as crime statistics, but as real people whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. Stephanie was a mother who was working to build a better life for herself and her son. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who mattered to the people who knew her. Ricky was just 10 years old when his life ended. He should have had decades ahead of him. First days of school, graduation ceremonies, first jobs, perhaps children of his own someday. Instead, his life was ended by an adult who should have been protecting him. The Willis family's statement during Johnson's legal proceedings captured their grief and their desire for justice. They spoke of Johnson murdering their daughter and grandson for absolutely no reason. A phrase that encapsulates the senseless nature of the crime and the impossibility of finding any rational explanation for what he did. Family members like Robert Hewitt, who served as both father and grandfather to the victims, had to navigate not only their grief, but also the lengthy legal process that followed. They attended court hearings, listened to testimony about their loved ones' final moments, and waited years for the justice system to provide some measure of accountability for their losses. Johnson's case raised several important legal questions that would be examined during his trial and appeals. The distinction between first-degree and second-degree murder was crucial, as was the question of whether the evidence truly supported a finding of premeditation in Ricky's death. The prosecution had to prove that Johnson's killing of Ricky wasn't simply an impulsive act committed in the heat of passion, but rather a deliberate decision to take the child's life. The evidence under the bed, the shell casings, blood, and bullet holes, was central to this argument, as it suggested that Johnson had pursued Ricky to his hiding place with the specific intent to kill him. The defense's argument that the crime scene investigation had imperfections was a common strategy in criminal cases, as attorneys often try to create reasonable doubt by questioning the reliability of physical evidence. However, the overwhelming nature of the evidence in this case made such arguments difficult to sustain. The case also highlighted the challenges that prosecutors face in death penalty cases, where they must not only prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but also convince a jury that the crimes warrant the ultimate punishment. The fact that the jury unanimously recommended death in Johnson's case suggested that they found the evidence overwhelming and the crimes particularly heinous. The Willis murder case demonstrates both the strengths and the challenges of the American criminal justice system. On one hand, the system worked as designed. Police responded quickly to the crime, investigators gathered evidence systematically, prosecutors built a strong case, and a jury carefully considered the evidence before reaching their verdict. The lengthy appeals process, while frustrating for victims' families who want closure, serves an important purpose in ensuring that death sentences are only carried out when appropriate. Every death penalty case receives this level of scrutiny because the stakes, a human life, are so high. However, the case also highlights some of the system's limitations. No amount of investigation, prosecution, or punishment can bring back Stephanie and Ricky Willis. The criminal justice system can provide accountability and perhaps deterrence, but it cannot undo the harm that was done or fully heal the wounds left by violent crime. The lengthy timeline, from the 2018 murders to the 2022 sentencing to the ongoing appeals process, also demonstrates how slowly justice can move, particularly in capital cases. While this deliberate pace is designed to prevent errors, it also means that families must wait years for final resolution of their cases. The murders of Stephanie and Ricky Willis serve as a tragic reminder of how quickly domestic situations can turn deadly. What began as a disagreement about television programming escalated to double murder in a matter of hours, if not minutes. The case underscores the importance of recognizing warning signs of domestic violence, and having resources available for victims who need help escaping dangerous situations. While we don't know all the details of Johnson and Stephanie's relationship history, the fact that such extreme violence emerged over a minor disagreement suggests that there may have been earlier signs of Johnson's potential for violence. For families dealing with domestic violence, the Willis case is a sobering reminder that children are often collateral victims of intimate partner violence. Ricky Willis died not because he had done anything wrong, but simply because he was present when Johnson decided to resolve a disagreement with gunfire. The case also raises questions about how we as a society address domestic violence prevention, mental health resources, and the factors that lead some individuals to choose violence over peaceful conflict resolution. While Johnson's actions were his own responsibility, understanding the broader context of domestic violence can help communities work to prevent similar tragedies. Today, Tyrone Johnson sits on Florida's death row, his case working its way through the appeals process that could take many more years to resolve. The appeals are automatic in death penalty cases, designed to ensure that no legal errors were made and that the death sentence was appropriately imposed. Meanwhile, the memory of Stephanie and Ricky Willis lives on in the hearts of their family members and friends. Their deaths were not just statistics in a crime report, but the loss of real people with hopes, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them. The case serves as a reminder that domestic violence is not a private matter when it claims lives, particularly the life of a child. The 10-year-old boy who died hiding under his bed had a right to safety, to childhood, to a future that was taken from him by an adult who chose violence over reason. In the end, the story of Stephanie and Ricky Willis is both a true crime case and a human tragedy. It's a reminder of how precious life is, how quickly it can be lost, and how important it is for all of us to choose peace over violence, even in our most frustrated and angry moments. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that most disagreements, even heated ones, end with compromise, conversation, or simply agreeing to disagree. The vast majority of people, when faced with conflict, choose solutions that don't involve violence. The tragedy of the Willis case is that Tyrone Johnson made a different choice, and two innocent people paid the ultimate price for his decision. The search for justice continues, but for Stephanie and Ricky Willis, their story ended far too soon on a quiet Sunday evening in Tampa, when what should have been a simple family night at home became the setting for an unthinkable crime. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we'll explore one of Tennessee's most disturbing cases, a story that unfolded in the quiet suburbs of Springfield, where beneath the surface of an ordinary marriage lay darkness that would shock an entire community. In the rolling hills of Robertson County, Tennessee, just outside Nashville, sits the peaceful town of Springfield. Tree-lined streets wind through modest subdivisions where families raise children and neighbors wave to each other from their front porches. It was here, on Clydesdale Lane, that Joseph and Samantha Parker built what appeared to be an ordinary life together. Samantha Parker was 44 years old in the autumn of 2014. Those who knew her described a woman who took pride in her home. She was what some called a neat freak, someone who found comfort in order and cleanliness. Her laughter was memorable to those who met her, a brightness that seemed to illuminate the rooms she entered. She had children from previous relationships and had become a grandmother, roles that brought her immense joy. Joseph Parker, 45, was her husband of 12 years. To neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed unremarkable quiet, perhaps, but not in a way that raised concern. He had worked as a car salesman at various dealerships around the Nashville area, including a Toyota dealership in Rivergate. Those who interacted with him professionally found him pleasant enough, the kind of man who could convince you to buy a car with his easy demeanor. But marriages, like houses, can have foundations that crack under pressure invisible to the outside world. What happened behind the closed doors of 246 Clydesdale Lane would reveal a relationship that had deteriorated far beyond what anyone could have imagined. November 5, 2014, was a Wednesday like any other in Springfield. The autumn air was crisp, leaves scattered across suburban lawns, and most residents were settling into their evening routines. But inside the Parker home, something had reached a terrible conclusion. The exact circumstances of what transpired that evening may never be fully understood. What we do know is that Joseph Parker, the man who had shared a bed with Samantha for over a decade, made a decision that would destroy not just her life, but the lives of everyone who loved them both. According to Joseph's later confession, he shot his wife that night. A single gunshot that ended the life of a woman who had trusted him, who had built a home with him, who had laughed at her own quirks just years before when friends visited their house. But the shooting was only the beginning of a horror that would unfold over the next 48 hours. For 2 entire days, Joseph Parker lived alone in that house with what he had done. Imagine, if you can, the weight of those hours, the silence where Samantha's voice should have been, the spaces she should have occupied, the conversations that would never happen again. During those 48 hours, Joseph made decisions that spoke to a mind completely detached from reality. Unable to face the finality of what he had done, he refused to accept that Samantha was truly gone. In his deteriorating mental state, he began to believe, or perhaps simply desperately hoped, that she might somehow return to life. It was during this time that Joseph committed acts that would shock even seasoned investigators. He dismembered Samantha's body, cutting off her legs in what can only be described as a grotesque attempt to fit her remains into their household freezer. The woman who had once laughed about being a neat freak was reduced to something her husband could store away, hidden from the world in the garage freezer where they once kept ice cream and frozen vegetables. The psychological state that would drive someone to such actions is difficult to comprehend. Perhaps it was denial so profound that it bordered on psychosis. Perhaps it was an attempt to preserve what he had destroyed. Or perhaps it was simply the desperate actions of a man who had crossed a line from which there could be no return. At 2:45 in the morning on November 7, 2014, exactly 2 days after the murder, something compelled Joseph Parker to pick up the phone and dial 911. What followed was one of the most disturbing emergency calls in Tennessee's criminal history. The dispatcher who answered that call could never have prepared for what they were about to hear. Joseph's voice came through the line, and his words painted a picture that seemed torn from a nightmare. He told the operator that he had shot his wife 2 days earlier, believing he had killed her. But now he claimed she was alive again. He insisted that despite the gunshot wound to her head, despite everything he had done to her, Samantha was somehow still responsive. He claimed she was still blinking, that he could still communicate with her. The desperation in his voice was palpable as he begged for help, asking for paramedics to come and save the woman he had murdered days before. In his fractured reality, he seemed to genuinely believe that medical intervention could somehow undo what he had done. The 911 operator, trained to handle emergencies but certainly not prepared for such a bizarre and horrific scenario, tried to gather information while dispatching units to the Clydesdale Lane address. Joseph provided his location willingly, seeming to believe that help was actually possible. What he didn't seem to fully grasp was that he was confessing to murder while simultaneously describing an impossible situation. The human mind, when faced with unbearable guilt and the finality of death, can create elaborate delusions to protect itself from reality. When Springfield police officers arrived at 246 Clydesdale Lane in the early morning hours, they found a scene that would haunt them for years to come. The neat, orderly home that Samantha had taken such pride in had become a crime scene of unthinkable brutality. Following Joseph's directions from the 911 call, officers made their way to the garage, where they discovered the upright freezer he had mentioned. Inside, they found Samantha Parker's remains, confirming what they already knew but Joseph seemed unable to accept. She had been dead for 2 days. The condition of her body told the story of those missing 48 hours. the dismemberment, the placement in the freezer, the delusion that she could somehow still be alive. It painted a picture of a man who had completely lost touch with reality after committing an unforgivable act. By the time police arrived, however, Joseph Parker was nowhere to be found. Somewhere between making the call and their arrival, reality had apparently crashed back down on him. He had fled, leaving behind the horror he had created and the woman he had claimed to love. News of the murder spread quickly through Springfield's tight-knit community. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation was called in to assist with what had become not just a homicide investigation, but a manhunt. Joseph Parker had become a fugitive, armed and dangerous, with nothing left to lose. Within hours, Joseph Parker was added to Tennessee's top 10 most wanted list. His description went out across state lines. A white male, 45 years old, 6 feet tall, approximately 200 pounds, possibly driving a white 2007 Toyota Camry with Tennessee license plate 682 NHF. But Joseph wasn't trying to disappear. Perhaps the weight of what he had done, or the return of sanity that made him realize the impossibility of his delusions, drove him not toward escape but toward a final act. His cell phone was tracked pinging towers as he traveled north from Springfield toward Nashville, then continued up Interstate 65 toward Kentucky. Law enforcement agencies across the region were alerted, and a coordinated effort began to locate him before he could harm anyone else. The Toyota dealership where Joseph had previously worked in Rivergate received a chilling phone call. Joseph threatened to return to kill multiple people at the location, sending employees into lockdown and prompting police to establish a command center in the dealership's parking lot. Helicopters circled overhead as officers prepared for a potential confrontation with an increasingly unstable and desperate man. But Joseph never returned to the dealership. Instead, he continued north on Interstate 65, crossing into Kentucky with law enforcement agencies coordinating his pursuit across state lines. Kentucky State Police had joined the effort to locate Joseph Parker, and their vigilance paid off near mile marker 12, on Interstate 65, just across the Tennessee border. Officers spotted the white Toyota Camry and began to close in, but they were too late to prevent the final tragedy of this case. As police vehicles approached, Joseph Parker made his last decision. Rather than face the consequences of what he had done, rather than explain the impossible delusions that had driven him to make that 911 call, he ended his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Officers found him slumped in the driver's seat of the Camry, the same hands that had once sold cars to families now forever still. The manhunt was over, but it had ended not with justice but with another death, another family destroyed. The house on Clydesdale Lane became a crime scene that investigators would spend days processing. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation worked meticulously to understand not just what had happened, but why. They found evidence of the shooting, the dismemberment, and the 2 days that Joseph had spent living with his crime. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case wasn't the physical evidence. It was the psychological puzzle of those 48 hours. What drives a person to such elaborate denial? How does the human mind protect itself from the weight of an unforgivable act by creating impossible realities? Mental health experts who later studied the case suggested that Joseph may have experienced a complete psychological break after the murder. The trauma of killing someone he had lived with for 12 years, combined with possible underlying mental illness, could have created the delusions that led to that bizarre 911 call. The community of Springfield was left to grapple with questions that had no easy answers. How well do we ever really know the people we see every day? What signs might have been missed? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Samantha Parker's death sent shockwaves through networks of family and friends who struggled to comprehend what had happened. She had been a mother and grandmother, someone who had touched lives in ways both large and small. Her children faced the unimaginable task of grieving a mother who had been murdered by a man they had known for years. One of the most remarkable aspects of this tragedy's aftermath came a year later, when Samantha's daughter made a public statement that stunned the community. Despite the horrific way her mother had died, despite the trauma Joseph Parker had inflicted on their entire family, She announced that she had found it in her heart to forgive him. This act of forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had happened or minimizing the horror of the crime. Instead, it represented a young woman's decision to not let the darkness of that November night define the rest of her life. In choosing forgiveness, she honored her mother's memory while refusing to carry the poison of hatred. Her words served as a reminder that even in the aftermath of unthinkable tragedy, the human capacity for grace and healing can emerge. It was perhaps the only light to come from such a dark chapter. Even now, years later, the case of Joseph and Samantha Parker raises questions that extend far beyond the facts of what happened. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, mental illness, and the hidden struggles that can exist behind closed doors. The tragedy highlights how domestic abuse can escalate suddenly and without warning to those outside the relationship. While we may never know the full history of Joseph and Samantha's marriage, the evidence suggests that whatever problems existed between them culminated in an explosion of violence that cost 2 lives. The case also illustrates the devastating impact of untreated mental illness. Joseph's behavior after the murder, the dismemberment, the delusions, the impossible hope that Samantha could somehow be saved, suggests a complete break from reality. It makes us wonder what might have been different if he had received help before reaching that breaking point. The detail that gave this case its grim notoriety was the freezer where Samantha's body was found. It became a symbol of the cold, calculated nature of what Joseph had done, but also of his desperate attempt to preserve what he had destroyed. Investigators noted that the freezer was in the garage, separate from the main living space of the house. This meant that for 2 days, Joseph had been able to go about some semblance of normal routine while knowing exactly what was hidden just steps away. He could make coffee in the morning, watch television in the evening, perhaps even sleep in the bed he had shared with Samantha, all while her remains were stored like forgotten leftovers in their garage. This spatial separation between the horror and the mundane speaks to the compartmentalization that allows people to commit unspeakable acts while maintaining the pretense of normalcy. It raises questions about how well we ever truly know anyone, even those closest to us. The recording of Joseph Parker's 911 call would later be released to the public, becoming one of the most disturbing pieces of audio evidence in recent true crime history. In it, you can hear a man pleading for help for a woman he had killed, genuinely believing that paramedics could somehow reverse death itself. The call lasted several minutes, during which Joseph repeatedly insisted that Samantha was alive, that she was blinking, that she needed immediate medical attention. His voice carried the urgency of someone facing a medical emergency, not the calm calculation of someone trying to cover up a murder. This wasn't a man trying to create an alibi or confuse investigators. This was someone who had become so detached from reality that he had convinced himself that death was reversible, that the violence he had inflicted could somehow be undone. The dispatcher, maintaining professional composure despite the bizarre nature of the call, continued to gather information while ensuring that emergency units were en route. They had no way of knowing that they were responding not to a medical emergency, but to a crime scene that would challenge even experienced investigators. Springfield, Tennessee, is the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where crime of this nature seems impossible. When news of Samantha's murder broke, it sent ripples of fear and confusion through the community. Neighbors reported that they had never heard fighting from the Parker home, never seen signs of domestic violence, never had reason to suspect that anything was wrong. This made the revelation all the more disturbing. If this could happen to the Parkers, it could happen to anyone. Local news coverage brought media attention to the quiet subdivision, transforming Clydesdale Lane from an anonymous residential street into the site of a notorious crime. Reporters stood where children had once played, broadcasting details that residents wished they could forget. The case became a topic of conversation in grocery stores, schools, and churches throughout the area. People struggled to understand how someone they had seen around town, someone who had seemed normal, could be capable of such violence. As investigators processed the crime scene, the full scope of what had happened became clear. The evidence told a story of deliberate violence followed by days of psychological breakdown. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation worked methodically through the house, documenting everything from the location of the shooting to the makeshift morgue Joseph had created in his garage. Each piece of evidence added another layer to a story that defied easy explanation. Crime scene analysts noted the contrast between the violence of the initial attack and the careful way Joseph had handled Samantha's remains afterward. It suggested a man who had acted in rage but then spent days trying to undo what could never be undone. The investigation also revealed the practical challenges Joseph had faced in his delusion. The human body is not designed to fit into a household freezer, hence the dismemberment. But rather than seeing this as evidence of death, Joseph's broken mind had somehow interpreted it as a temporary storage solution. Joseph's final journey up Interstate 65 was tracked by multiple law enforcement agencies as his cell phone pinged towers along the route. Traffic cameras captured images of the white Toyota Camry moving north, carrying a man who had nothing left to run toward. The drive from Springfield to where he was finally located in Kentucky took several hours. During that time, Joseph was alone with his thoughts, with the full weight of what he had done, and with the certain knowledge that there was no escape from the consequences. Psychological experts later suggested that this final journey represented a man coming to terms with reality. The delusions that had sustained him for 2 days were crumbling, replaced by the stark truth of his situation. He had murdered his wife, mutilated her body, and convinced himself she was still alive. Now, faced with the approach of law enforcement, he could no longer maintain those impossible beliefs. When Kentucky State Police located Joseph Parker's vehicle near mile marker 12, they approached with caution. They knew they were dealing with a man who had committed murder and who had made threats against others. They were prepared for a confrontation, for resistance, for any number of possible scenarios. What they found instead was silence. Joseph Parker had ended his own life before officers could reach him, taking with him any chance of understanding the full truth of what had driven him to such extremes. The investigation into his death was straightforward, a self-inflicted gunshot wound that ended a 2-day flight from justice. But the simplicity of that conclusion belied the complexity of the psychological journey that had brought him to that final moment. In death, Joseph Parker left behind more questions than answers. His final act ensured that no trial would ever fully explore the deterioration of his marriage, the state of his mental health, or the specific events that led to that November night. In the aftermath of such a horrific crime, it becomes easy to focus on the perpetrator, on the shocking nature of his actions and the bizarre delusions that followed. But at the center of this tragedy was Samantha Parker, a real person whose life was cut short by someone who should have protected her. Those who knew Samantha remembered her pride in her home and family. She had worked hard to create a life she could be proud of, to build relationships that mattered, to be a positive presence in the lives of her children and grandchildren. The friends who had visited the Parker home in happier times recalled her self-deprecating humor about her need for everything to be clean and organized. It was a harmless quirk that spoke to someone who found peace in order, who created beauty in the details of daily life. Samantha had survived whatever challenges life had thrown at her before that November night. She had raised children, become a grandmother, and built a home that reflected her values. She deserved to see many more years, to watch her grandchildren grow up, to continue being the organized, caring woman her friends remembered. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this case was its impact on Samantha's children. In a single night, they lost not only their mother to violence, but also any chance of understanding why it had happened. Joseph's suicide ensured that they would never receive explanations, never have the opportunity to confront him in court, never find closure through the justice system. The children faced the impossible task of grieving for a mother who had been murdered while also processing the complex emotions surrounding their stepfather's role in her death and his subsequent suicide. They were left to navigate a world where the man who had been part of their family for years had committed the ultimate betrayal. Yet somehow, in the midst of this unimaginable trauma, one of Samantha's daughters found the strength to speak publicly about forgiveness. A year after the murders, she announced that she had forgiven Joseph Parker for what he had done to their family. This forgiveness didn't come from a place of weakness or denial. Instead, it represented a conscious choice to not let Joseph's actions continue to poison their lives. It was a decision to honor their mother's memory by choosing healing over hatred, hope over despair. Mental health professionals who studied the Parker case were particularly intrigued by Joseph's behavior during the 2 days between the murder and his 911 call. His genuine belief that Samantha was still alive, despite clear evidence to the contrary, represented an extreme form of psychological denial. This type of break from reality can occur when someone commits an act so far outside their normal moral framework that their mind simply refuses to accept it. Rather than face the truth of what they've done, the psyche creates elaborate alternative explanations that allow them to continue functioning. In Joseph's case, this denial manifested as the belief that death was temporary, that medical intervention could reverse what he had done. It's possible that he spent those 2 days talking to Samantha's remains, convinced that she was responding, that she was still present in some way. This psychological state, while fascinating from a clinical perspective, also underscores the tragedy of untreated mental illness. Had Joseph received help for whatever underlying issues contributed to his breakdown, both he and Samantha might still be alive today. Springfield, Tennessee, eventually moved past the immediate shock of the Parker case, but it left lasting changes in the community. Residents became more aware of domestic violence resources, more attuned to signs that their neighbors might be struggling behind closed doors. Local churches and community organizations used the tragedy as an opportunity to discuss mental health awareness and domestic violence prevention. While nothing could bring Samantha back, her death sparked conversations that might help prevent similar tragedies in the future. The house on Clydesdale Lane eventually found new owners, people willing to create new memories in a place that had seen such darkness. Life continued in the subdivision. Children rode bikes on the street where police cars had once gathered, and slowly the acute pain of the tragedy faded into the background of community memory. The case of Joseph and Samantha Parker serves as a stark reminder of how quickly an ordinary life can transform into an unthinkable nightmare. It challenges our assumptions about domestic violence, mental illness, and the people we think we know. Perhaps most importantly, it highlights the hidden nature of domestic abuse. The Parkers' neighbors saw no warning signs, heard no arguments, witnessed no violence. This isn't uncommon. Domestic abuse often occurs behind closed doors, hidden from even those who live nearby. The case also demonstrates how mental health crises can escalate rapidly and unpredictably. While we may never know what specific factors contributed to Joseph's breakdown, his actions suggest someone who had completely lost touch with reality and moral reasoning. As we reflect on this tragic case, we're left with questions that may never have satisfactory answers. What drove Joseph Parker to murder the woman he had lived with for 12 years? What psychological factors contributed to his elaborate delusions afterward? Could this tragedy have been prevented if warning signs had been recognized earlier? These questions matter not because we need to excuse Joseph's actions, but because understanding the factors that contribute to such tragedies might help prevent them in the future. Every case like this is an opportunity to learn, to recognize warning signs, to provide better support for those struggling with mental health issues or domestic violence. On quiet nights in Springfield, Tennessee, when the suburban streets are empty and most residents are safely asleep in their beds, it's easy to imagine that tragedies like the Parker case couldn't happen in such peaceful surroundings. But this case reminds us that darkness can emerge anywhere, that the most ordinary-seeming lives can hide extraordinary pain. Samantha Parker deserved better than the fate that befell her that November night. She deserved to live out her years surrounded by the family she loved, in the home she had worked so hard to maintain. Her death was not just a crime, but a theft of all the moments she should have had: birthdays and holidays, conversations with her children, quiet mornings in her well-organized kitchen. Joseph Parker's journey from suburban husband to murderer to fugitive speaks to the fragility of the human psyche when faced with overwhelming stress, untreated mental illness, or relationship pressures that exceed our ability to cope. His final act on that Kentucky highway ensured that we would never fully understand what drove him to such extremes. The children and grandchildren left behind continue to carry the weight of this tragedy, but they also carry Samantha's memory forward. In choosing forgiveness over hatred, in building new lives from the wreckage of that November night, they honor her in ways that no trial or conviction ever could. As you drift off to sleep tonight, safe in your own bed, perhaps spare a thought for Samantha Parker. Not for the horrible way she died, but for the life she lived, the love she gave, and the family who continues to remember her not as a victim of a crime, but as a woman who deserved so much more than the hand fate dealt her. The case remains closed in the official sense, both perpetrator and victim claimed by that terrible week in November 2014. But the questions it raises about domestic violence, mental health, and the hidden struggles of seemingly ordinary people continue to resonate, reminding us that behind every closed door, someone might be fighting battles we never see. Rest well, knowing that for all the darkness this case revealed, it also showed us the power of forgiveness, the strength of family bonds, and the importance of community support in the face of unthinkable tragedy. These are the lessons that matter, the truths that help us make sense of senseless acts, the hope that emerges even from the deepest darkness. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we journey to Jacksonville, Florida, in the summer of 2013. It's a story that shook a community and reminded us all how quickly a normal evening can turn into every parent's worst nightmare. This is the story of 8-year-old Cherish Periwinkle, whose life was cut tragically short on what should have been just another shopping trip with her mother. The evening of June 21st, 2013, began like many others for the Periwinkle family. Rain Periwinkle, a young mother struggling to make ends meet, had planned to take her 3 daughters shopping for new clothes. 8-year-old Cherish was the eldest, followed by her 2 younger sisters. The family didn't have much money, but Rain wanted to get the girls some new outfits before an important trip. You see, Cherish was supposed to fly to California the very next morning to spend the summer with her father. It was a trip she had been looking forward to, and Rain wanted her daughter to have some nice new clothes to take with her. The excitement of the upcoming journey filled their small apartment as they prepared for what they thought would be a quick shopping expedition. Around 8 o'clock that evening, the family made their way to a Dollar General store on West Edgewood Avenue. It was a modest store in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where families like the Periwinkles often shopped when money was tight. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Rain and her daughters wandered the aisles, looking at clothes and calculating prices in their heads. As they browsed, Rain's heart sank. The prices were higher than she had hoped. She watched as her daughters held up shirts and dresses, their eyes bright with possibility, only to see that same light dim when they realized the clothes were beyond their budget. It was a familiar disappointment for a mother doing her best in difficult circumstances. It was at this moment of quiet desperation that Donald James Smith entered their lives. Smith was a 57-year-old man with a weathered face and an easy smile. He had been watching the family as they shopped, observing their disappointment as they put items back on the shelves. To Rain, he seemed like an ordinary customer, perhaps even a concerned fellow shopper. Smith approached the family with what appeared to be genuine kindness. He had noticed their situation, he said, and wanted to help. He told Rain that his wife worked at Walmart and had a gift card, around $150, that they weren't going to use. He claimed he would be happy to let the family use it to buy clothes for the children. To a struggling mother, this seemed like a miracle. Here was a stranger offering exactly what they needed at exactly the right moment. Rain looked at her daughters, particularly at Cherish, who would be leaving for California in just a few hours. The opportunity to send her eldest daughter off with new clothes seemed too good to pass up. Smith presented himself as a family man who understood their situation. He spoke gently and seemed genuinely concerned about their welfare. What Rain didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Donald Smith was a registered sex offender with a long criminal history involving children. He had been on the sex offender registry since 1993 and had only recently been released from prison. But in that moment, under the bright lights of the Dollar General, he simply seemed like a good Samaritan. Rain made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She accepted his offer. Smith suggested they drive to the Walmart on Lem Turner Road, where he said his wife worked and where they could use the gift card. He led them outside to his white van, a vehicle that would later become central to the investigation. The family climbed in, with Rain sitting in the front passenger seat and the three girls in the back. The drive to Walmart was relatively short, filled with what seemed like friendly conversation. Smith continued to present himself as a helpful neighbor, asking about the children and their plans. Cherish, an outgoing 8-year-old with a bright smile, chatted easily with this new adult who was being so kind to her family. When they arrived at the Walmart, the store was bustling with evening shoppers. The family walked through the automatic doors together, Smith guiding them toward the children's clothing section. For the next hour or so, they browsed the aisles, with Smith encouraging the girls to pick out items they liked. The surveillance cameras captured it all, a seemingly normal shopping trip with what appeared to be a family friend or relative. Cherish tried on clothes, laughed with her sisters, and stayed close to her mother. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, which is what made what happened next so shocking. As the evening wore on, Smith suggested they grab some food from the McDonald's inside the Walmart. It was getting late, and the girls were hungry. They made their way to the restaurant area, where Smith offered to buy them dinner. Again, this seemed like continued generosity from their new benefactor. But something began to feel off. Smith's behavior started to change subtly. He became more insistent about certain things, more controlling of the situation. Rain later testified that she began to feel uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. It was then that Smith made a suggestion that would seal Cherish's fate. He told Rain that he needed to go get the gift card from his wife, who was working somewhere in the store. But he suggested that Cherish come with him to help carry things, while Rain stayed at McDonald's with the younger children. In hindsight, every alarm bell should have been ringing. But in the moment, with her guard lowered by hours of seemingly innocent interaction, Rain hesitated only briefly. Smith had been so kind, so helpful. What harm could there be in letting Cherish walk through the store with him for a few minutes? The security footage shows the exact moment when everything changed. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Smith and Cherish walked together toward the front of the store. Cherish appeared calm, trusting, walking alongside the man who had been so nice to her family all evening. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Rain waited at the McDonald's with her two younger daughters, expecting Smith and Cherish to return any moment with the promised gift card. But as time stretched on, a growing sense of unease settled in her stomach. She began to look around the restaurant area, then ventured into the store proper, calling Cherish's name. Other shoppers continued their evening routines, unaware that a mother's world was beginning to collapse. Rain asked store employees if they had seen her daughter, describing Cherish and the man she was with. The horrible realization dawned slowly, then all at once. They were gone, both of them. Cherish and the helpful stranger who had seemed like such a blessing just hours before had vanished from the store. The panic that follows a missing child is unlike any other human experience. Rain's voice cracked as she asked store managers to check the surveillance footage. She called Cherish's name throughout the vast store, her voice growing more desperate with each unanswered call. Other shoppers began to notice the commotion, some joining in the search through the aisles. At 11:16 p.m., Rain made the call that every parent hopes they'll never have to make. Her voice, captured forever in the 9/11 recording, was filled with a terror that words can barely convey. "I'm at Walmart and I can't find my daughter," she told the dispatcher. "She was with a man, and now I can't find either one of them." The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office responded immediately. Within minutes, the Walmart was swarming with police officers, their radios crackling with descriptions of a missing 8-year-old girl and the man she was last seen with. The store's surveillance system became the focus of intense scrutiny. Detective Chris Johns was one of the first investigators on the scene. He quickly realized they were dealing with a potential abduction, not a lost child. The surveillance footage told a clear story. At 10:44 p.m., cameras captured Donald Smith and Cherish Periwinkle walking together toward the store's exit. The timestamp would become burned into the memory of everyone involved in the case. The footage showed Cherish appearing calm as she walked beside Smith, having no idea she was walking toward her death. They passed through the store's entrance doors and into the parking lot, where Smith's white van was waiting. Security cameras lost sight of them after that. Law enforcement immediately issued an Amber Alert. Cherish's description was broadcast across Florida and beyond. 8 years old, blonde hair, wearing a pink dress. The description of Smith's van went out to every police cruiser in the region. Time was critical. Statistics show that abducted children are most likely to be killed within the first 3 hours of their disappearance. As the investigation ramped up, detectives learned more about Donald Smith. What they discovered sent chills through the department. Smith was a convicted sex offender with a history that dated back decades. He had been released from prison earlier that year after serving time for attempted kidnapping of a minor. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Throughout the night, Jacksonville became a city on high alert. Police helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights sweeping through parks, wooded areas, and empty parking lots. Patrol cars cruised through neighborhoods where Smith was known to have lived or visited. The media picked up the story, and Cherish's photo appeared on television screens across the region. Rain Periwinkle found herself in the surreal position of being both victim and witness. She worked with police sketch artists to refine the description of Smith, even though the surveillance footage had captured him clearly. She provided details about their conversation, about the promises he had made, about the seemingly innocent way the evening had begun. The investigation revealed that Smith had given investigators false information about where he lived. The address he provided led to an empty house. His van, which had been captured on numerous traffic cameras leaving the Walmart area, seemed to have vanished into the Jacksonville night. Volunteers joined the search effort. Community members who had seen Cherish's photo on the news drove through their neighborhoods, hoping to spot the white van or catch a glimpse of the missing girl. Churches opened their doors for prayer vigils. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, hoping against hope that somewhere out there, Cherish was still alive. The morning of June 22nd brought news that everyone had been dreading but expecting. At approximately 9 a.m., a body was discovered in Broward River. The location was about 5 miles from the Walmart where Cherish had last been seen alive. A fisherman had spotted something in the water and called authorities. When police arrived, they confirmed their worst fears. The body was that of a young girl matching Cherish's description. She was still wearing the pink dress she had put on for the shopping trip that was supposed to end with her flying to California. The discovery of Cherish's body transformed the missing person case into a homicide investigation. The medical examiner's office took custody of the remains, and the painstaking process of gathering evidence began. What they would find would prove that Cherish's final hours had been a nightmare beyond comprehension. Meanwhile, the search for Donald Smith intensified. Police now had a clear timeline. Cherish had been abducted around 10:44 p.m., and her body was discovered less than 11 hours later. Smith had killed her quickly after taking her from the store, then disposed of her body in the river. Smith's van was spotted later that morning by alert law enforcement officers. He was found at a church parking lot, appearing disheveled and nervous. When approached by police, he initially tried to maintain his innocent facade, but the evidence against him was already overwhelming. The arrest was swift and decisive. Smith was taken into custody without incident, though investigators noted his demeanor was strange. He seemed almost relieved to be caught. Perhaps the weight of what he had done was finally settling in, or perhaps he knew that his long history of crimes against children had finally caught up with him. At the police station, Smith was questioned extensively. Detectives were professional but thorough, building their case with methodical precision. They had surveillance footage, witness testimony from Rain Periwinkle, and physical evidence from the van. Smith's criminal history painted a picture of a predator who had been escalating his crimes for years. The interrogation rooms in Jacksonville had seen many criminals, but few cases affected the veteran detectives like this one. The senseless brutality of the crime, combined with the innocence of the victim, created an atmosphere of barely contained anger and determination to see justice done. As investigators dug deeper into Smith's background, a disturbing pattern emerged. His first conviction for crimes against children had occurred in 1993, nearly 20 years before he encountered the Periwinkle family. Over the decades, he had been in and out of prison, always for offenses involving minors. Smith's criminal record read like a catalog of escalating predatory behavior. There had been attempted kidnappings, inappropriate contact with children, and violations of his sex offender registration requirements. Each time he was released from prison, he seemed to become bolder, more willing to take risks. The most chilling aspect of his history was how he had perfected his approach over the years. The helpful stranger routine, the offers of assistance to struggling families, the gradual building of trust. These were not spontaneous acts of kindness, but calculated predatory behavior designed to gain access to children. Investigators realized that what happened to Cherish was not a crime of opportunity, but the culmination of decades of criminal behavior. Smith had been hunting for the right victim, the right circumstances, and the right moment to strike. The Periwinkle family had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The physical evidence against Smith was overwhelming. DNA evidence linked him definitively to Cherish's murder. Surveillance footage from multiple cameras tracked his movements throughout the evening. Cell phone tower data placed his phone in the area where Cherish's body was found. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Smith himself. Unknown to him, jail officials had been recording his phone conversations and monitoring his behavior while he was in custody. In these recordings, Smith made statements that amounted to confessions, describing details of the crime that only the perpetrator could have known. The forensic evidence painted a picture of unspeakable brutality. The medical examiner's findings, which would later be presented at trial, showed that Cherish had suffered tremendously in her final hours. The details were so disturbing that even experienced investigators struggled to maintain their composure while reviewing the evidence. Meanwhile, the Jacksonville community rallied around the Periwinkle family. Vigils were held for Cherish, and funds were established to help cover funeral expenses and support the surviving family members. The case had touched something deep in the collective consciousness of the city. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting the horrific details of the crime while respecting the dignity of the victim and her family. The state attorney's office, led by Melissa Nelson, prepared meticulously for what they knew would be one of the most difficult cases of their careers. The defense team faced a nearly impossible task. The evidence against Smith was overwhelming, and his criminal history made any claim of innocence seem absurd. Their strategy would ultimately focus on trying to spare his life during the penalty phase, arguing against the death penalty despite the heinous nature of the crime. For Rain Periwinkle, the approaching trial meant reliving the worst night of her life in front of a jury, media, and the man who had destroyed her family. She would have to face Smith in court and recount how his seeming kindness had lured her into trusting him with her daughter's life. The weight of guilt was enormous. Every parent who heard the story wondered if they would have made the same decision Rain did. In hindsight, the warning signs seem obvious, but in the moment, with a helpful stranger offering assistance to a struggling family, the choices seemed reasonable. When the trial began in February 2018, nearly 5 years after Cherish's murder, the Jacksonville courthouse was packed. Media from across the nation covered the proceedings, drawn by the shocking nature of the crime and the compelling story of how a family's trust had been so violently betrayed. Rain Periwinkle's testimony was heartbreaking. She described the events of that evening in painstaking detail, from the first meeting at Dollar General to the horrifying realization that her daughter was gone. Her voice broke as she recounted how normal everything had seemed, how Smith had appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a good Samaritan willing to help a family in need. The surveillance footage was played for the jury, showing Cherish walking trustingly beside her killer. The images were difficult to watch, knowing what was about to happen to the innocent child captured on camera. Jurors saw how Smith had carefully cultivated the family's trust over several hours before making his move. Expert witnesses testified about Smith's pattern of behavior, explaining how predators like him operate. They described the grooming process, the way trust is built and then exploited, and how Smith's approach to the Periwinkle family fit a classic predatory pattern. State Attorney Melissa Nelson presented the prosecution's case with clinical precision, walking the jury through the timeline of events and the mountain of evidence against Smith. She described how Smith had specifically targeted a vulnerable family, how he had planned and executed cherished abduction, and how he had shown no mercy to his 8-year-old victim. The medical examiner's testimony was particularly difficult. Dr. Valerie Rao, who had performed the autopsy, had to take breaks during her testimony because the details were so disturbing. Her findings confirmed that Cherish had been subjected to horrific sexual violence before being murdered. The DNA evidence was unambiguous. Smith's genetic material was found on Cherish's body and clothing, definitively linking him to the crime. There was no question about who had committed this terrible act. Perhaps most chilling were the jail recordings where Smith discussed the crime. In conversations with other inmates and during monitored phone calls, he revealed details about what he had done to Cherish. These recordings removed any doubt about his guilt and showed a complete lack of remorse for his actions. Smith's defense attorneys faced the unenviable task of defending the indefensible. With overwhelming evidence of their client's guilt, they focused their efforts on trying to humanize him enough to spare his life. They presented evidence of Smith's troubled childhood, his mental health issues, and his history of substance abuse. The defense argued that while Smith was guilty of the crime, he was also a product of circumstances beyond his control. They painted a picture of a damaged individual who had never received proper treatment for his psychological problems. It was a strategy born of desperation rather than strength. But the prosecution's case was simply too strong. The evidence was clear, the crime was horrific, and Smith's long history of offenses against children showed a pattern of behavior that could not be explained away by childhood trauma or mental illness. Throughout the trial, Smith himself seemed detached from the proceedings. He rarely showed emotion, even when the most disturbing details of his crime were being discussed. This apparent lack of remorse only strengthened the prosecution's case for the death penalty. After hearing all the evidence, the jury deliberated for just 14 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. It was one of the fastest jury deliberations in Jacksonville's history, reflecting the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Smith. The speed of the verdict sent a clear message about how the community viewed this crime. There was no doubt, no hesitation, no uncertainty about Smith's guilt. The surveillance footage, the DNA evidence, the recorded confessions, and the testimony all painted an undeniable picture of his responsibility for Cherish's death. During the penalty phase, the jury was asked to decide whether Smith should receive life in prison or death. Once again, their decision came quickly. After just 30 minutes of deliberation, they unanimously recommended the death penalty. The judge, accepting the jury's recommendation, formally sentenced Smith to death. In pronouncing the sentence, the judge spoke about the exceptional cruelty of the crime and the complete innocence of the victim. Smith showed no visible reaction to learning he would die for his crimes. For the Jacksonville community, the case represented both justice served and innocence lost. The fact that such a brutal crime could happen so quickly, in such a public place, to such an innocent victim, shattered many people's sense of security. Parents throughout the region had difficult conversations with their children about stranger danger, about trust, and about the sad reality that not all adults who seem kind actually are kind. The case became a teaching moment, though one that came at the highest possible cost. For Rain Periwinkle, the trial's conclusion brought some measure of closure, but no real peace. Her daughter was still gone, the victim of a predator who had exploited her mother's trust and desperation. The guilt and grief would be lifelong companions, despite the fact that she had been as much a victim of Smith's manipulation as her daughter had been. The criminal justice system had worked as designed. Smith was caught, tried, and sentenced to death. But justice, while served, could never bring back the bright, trusting 8-year-old who had been looking forward to spending the summer with her father in California. The Cherish Periwinkle case serves as a stark reminder of how predators operate in our society. Smith didn't snatch a child off the street in a moment of impulse. Instead, he carefully identified a vulnerable family, built their trust over several hours, and then exploited that trust to gain access to his victim. The case highlighted the importance of trusting one's instincts, even when dealing with seemingly helpful strangers. Rain later said she had begun to feel uncomfortable with Smith's behavior, but had dismissed those feelings because he had seemed so kind and helpful. Law enforcement officials used the case to educate the public about predatory behavior. They emphasized that criminals like Smith are often skilled at appearing normal, helpful, and trustworthy. The stereotype of the dangerous stranger lurking in shadows doesn't match the reality of how most child abductions occur. The case also sparked discussions about the effectiveness of sex offender registries and monitoring systems. Smith had been a registered sex offender for 20 years, yet he was still able to approach and gain the trust of a family with young children. Questions were raised about whether more could have been done to prevent this tragedy. As with most death penalty cases, Smith's conviction and sentence began a lengthy appeals process. His attorneys argued that his original trial counsel had been ineffective, that the evidence against him had been improperly admitted, and that the death penalty was inappropriate given his mental health history. These appeals are standard procedure in capital cases, designed to ensure that the death penalty is only applied when appropriate and after all legal requirements have been met. For the Periwinkle family, however, each appeal represented another delay in final justice for Cherish. The Florida Supreme Court ultimately upheld Smith's conviction and death sentence, finding that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that proper legal procedures had been followed throughout his trial. The court noted the exceptional brutality of the crime and the complete innocence of the victim in affirming the death penalty. Despite these legal victories, Smith remains on death row as of today, where he will likely spend years more while additional appeals work their way through the courts. The death penalty process in Florida, as in most states, is deliberately slow and thorough, ensuring that only the most heinous crimes result in execution. Jacksonville's Walmart stores implemented new security measures in the wake of Cherish's murder. Additional cameras were installed, security personnel were given enhanced training, and new protocols were established for responding to missing children reports. The case became a touchstone for discussions about child safety throughout Florida and beyond. Parents shared the story as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the importance of staying vigilant, even in seemingly safe situations like shopping at familiar stores. Local schools invited law enforcement officers to speak to children about personal safety, using age-appropriate language to help them understand the difference between appropriate and inappropriate adult behavior. The goal was to educate without creating excessive fear, a delicate balance that educators and parents continue to navigate. The Dollar General, where the family first met Smith, also became part of the story. Employees were trained to recognize potentially dangerous situations and to know how to respond if they suspected a customer might be in danger. The store's role in the tragedy, while unintentional, served as a reminder that public spaces require constant vigilance. 8-year-old Cherish Periwinkle had been a typical child in many ways. She loved playing with her sisters, enjoyed school, and was excited about visiting her father in California. She had dreams and plans and a bright future that should have stretched out before her for decades to come. Those who knew Cherish remembered her as a happy, outgoing child who trusted easily and loved deeply. She had no reason to fear the adult world around her. No experience that would have taught her to be suspicious of a helpful stranger in a store. In a cruel irony, Cherish's trusting nature, one of her most endearing qualities, became the very thing that made her vulnerable to Smith's predatory behavior. Her willingness to see the good in people, to accept kindness at face value, was exactly what Smith had counted on when he approached her family. The tragedy of Cherish's story is not just that she died, but that she died because she possessed the very qualities we want children to have: trust, openness, and faith in the goodness of others. The world became a little darker when those qualities led to her death. The murder of Cherish Periwinkle was not an isolated incident but part of a larger pattern of crimes against children that occurs with disturbing regularity. Statistics show that hundreds of children are abducted by strangers each year, though most cases don't receive the media attention that Cherish did. What made Cherish's case particularly notable was how clearly it demonstrated the methods used by child predators. The surveillance footage provided a real-time view of how a skilled manipulator can gain access to a child through seemingly innocent means. Law enforcement experts used the case to train other officers in recognizing predatory behavior and responding to child abduction cases. The clear timeline and extensive evidence made it an ideal teaching case, though one that came at a terrible human cost. The case also highlighted the challenges faced by single mothers like Rain Periwinkle: financial stress, social isolation, and the constant struggle to provide for children can create vulnerabilities that predators are skilled at identifying and exploiting. Years after the trial's conclusion, the Cherish Periwinkle case continues to influence how law enforcement, schools, and communities approach child safety. Her story is told in training seminars, safety presentations, and awareness campaigns across the country. The case became a catalyst for legislative discussions about monitoring sex offenders and protecting children from repeat predators. While Smith's previous convictions had put him on the sex offender registry, the system had not prevented him from approaching and gaining the trust of another family with children. Advocates for children's safety point to Cherish's case as evidence that current systems for monitoring dangerous individuals need to be strengthened. They argue that someone with Smith's history should never have been in a position to encounter unsupervised children in a public place. The debate continues about how to balance civil liberties with public safety, how to monitor dangerous individuals without creating a police state, and how to protect children without teaching them to fear all adults. For Rain Periwinkle, life after Cherish's murder has been a journey through grief, guilt, and gradual healing. She has had to live with the knowledge that her decision to trust Donald Smith cost her daughter's life, while also understanding that she was as much a victim of his manipulation as Cherish was. In the years since the trial, Rain has spoken publicly about the case, hoping that sharing her story might prevent other families from experiencing a similar tragedy. She has emphasized that Smith was skilled at appearing trustworthy, that his offer of help seemed genuine, and that any parent in her situation might have made the same decision. The support of the Jacksonville community has been crucial to her healing process. Strangers became friends, offering practical help and emotional support during the darkest period of her life. The outpouring of compassion showed the best of human nature in response to one of its worst expressions. Rain has also had to navigate the complex process of helping her surviving daughters understand what happened to their sister. Explaining such senseless violence to children requires a delicate balance of honesty and protection, truth and hope. The Cherish Periwinkle case prompted reviews of several systems designed to protect children. The sex offender registry, the parole system, and protocols for monitoring dangerous individuals all came under scrutiny in the wake of her murder. Investigators found that Smith had violated several terms of his parole and sex offender registration requirements in the months leading up to Cherish's murder. These violations, while noted, had not resulted in his return to prison or enhanced monitoring. The case highlighted gaps in the system that allowed dangerous individuals to slip through the cracks. New protocols were implemented to ensure better communication between different law enforcement agencies. The goal was to create a more comprehensive monitoring system that would flag dangerous behavior patterns before they escalated to violence. Training programs for store employees, social workers, and others who work with families were enhanced to help them recognize potential predatory behavior. The idea was to create multiple layers of protection that might catch dangerous individuals before they could harm children. The extensive media coverage of the Cherish Periwinkle case brought national attention to issues of child safety and predatory behavior. News outlets across the country covered the trial, often focusing on the surveillance footage that showed Cherish's final moments of freedom. While the media attention helped raise awareness about child safety issues, it also raised questions about the appropriate level of coverage for such sensitive cases. The graphic details of Cherish's murder were widely reported, leading to debates about how much information should be shared with the public. The case became a staple of true crime television shows, podcasts, and online discussions. Each retelling brought Cherish's story to new audiences, keeping her memory alive while also serving as a warning about the dangers that children face from predators. For the Periwinkle family, the media attention was a double-edged sword. While it helped ensure that justice was served and raised awareness about child safety, it also meant that their most private tragedy became public property, discussed and analyzed by strangers around the world. The investigation into Cherish's murder showcased both the capabilities and limitations of modern law enforcement. Surveillance technology, DNA analysis, and digital forensics provided clear evidence of Smith's guilt, but they could not prevent the crime from occurring in the first place. Detectives worked around the clock in the first crucial hours after Cherish's disappearance, knowing that time was their enemy. The rapid response and professional investigation ensured that Smith was caught quickly and that the evidence against him was preserved and properly analyzed. The case demonstrated the importance of community involvement in investigations. Tips from citizens, volunteer search efforts, and media coverage all played roles in keeping the case in the public eye and maintaining pressure for a swift resolution. However, the investigation also revealed how easy it had been for Smith to approach and manipulate the Periwinkle family. Despite being a registered sex offender with a long criminal history, he had been able to gain their trust within minutes of meeting them. Smith's trial and conviction set important legal precedents for how similar cases are prosecuted. The use of surveillance footage, jail recordings, and DNA evidence created a template that other prosecutors have since followed in comparable cases. The death penalty sentence was significant given the changing attitudes toward capital punishment in many states. Florida's willingness to seek and obtain a death sentence in this case sent a clear message about how the state views crimes against children. The appeals process has also been closely watched by legal experts, as Smith's attorneys have raised various constitutional and procedural challenges to his conviction and sentence. Each ruling in the case adds to the body of law governing capital punishment in child murder cases. The case has been cited in numerous other trials and legal proceedings, serving as an example of how modern investigative techniques can be used to build overwhelming cases against dangerous criminals. Smith currently resides on death row at Union Correctional Institution in Florida, where he awaits the resolution of his appeals. Death row inmates in Florida are housed in single cells and allowed limited contact with other prisoners and the outside world. The daily routine on death row is strictly regulated, with inmates spending most of their time in their cells. Smith has access to books, television, and limited recreational activities, but his world has shrunk to the confines of a prison cell where he will likely spend the remainder of his life. Other death row inmates and prison staff know the details of Smith's crime. Crimes against children are viewed with particular disgust even among convicted criminals, meaning that Smith exists at the bottom of the prison hierarchy. His appeals continue to work their way through the courts, but legal experts believe it is unlikely that his conviction will be overturned given the strength of the evidence against him. The main question is not whether he will ultimately be executed, but when. The story of Cherish Periwinkle is ultimately a story about the loss of innocence, both for one 8-year-old girl and for an entire community that learned how quickly evil can disguise itself as kindness. It's a reminder that predators don't always lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they appear as helpful strangers in well-lit stores, offering assistance to families in need. Cherish's legacy lives on in the countless safety conversations that have taken place because of her story. Parents across the country have used her case to teach their children about trusting their instincts, about the importance of staying close to family, and about the reality that some people who seem nice may not have good intentions. The case also serves as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who work tirelessly to protect children and bring justice to families who have suffered unimaginable loss. The investigators who worked on Cherish's case carried her memory with them, ensuring that every piece of evidence was carefully preserved and every lead was thoroughly investigated. In Jacksonville, Cherish is remembered not just as a victim, but as a bright, loving child who brought joy to everyone who knew her. Memorial gardens were planted in her honor, and scholarships were established in her name. The community chose to remember her life, not just her death. Her story continues to echo through courtrooms, classrooms, and family conversations wherever people gather to discuss child safety. While we cannot bring Cherish back, we can honor her memory by learning from the circumstances of her death and working to ensure that other children are better protected. The surveillance footage from that June evening in 2013 captured the last moments of a trusting child's life, but it also provided the evidence needed to ensure that her killer faced justice. In the end, Cherish Periwinkle's story became both a tragedy and a call to action, a reminder that protecting our children requires constant vigilance and that evil sometimes wears the mask of kindness. As we conclude this difficult but important story, we remember Cherish not as a statistic or a case study, but as a real child who loved and was loved, who had dreams and hopes, and whose life was cut short by an act of unspeakable cruelty. Her memory serves as both a warning and an inspiration, a warning about the dangers that exist in our world, and an inspiration to do better at protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The night is quiet now, and somewhere in Florida, justice waits for Donald Smith on death row while a community continues to heal from the wounds left by his crime. Cherish Periwinkle rests in peace, her story serving as an eternal reminder that in a world where evil sometimes masquerades as good, vigilance is the price of innocence. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we journey into the quiet farmlands of Champaign County, Ohio, where beneath the surface of small-town normalcy, a family struggled with demons they couldn't see coming. This is the story of Heidi Taylor, a woman whose life was built around love and sacrifice, and the tragic events of April 6, 2017, that would shatter everything she held dear. Heidi Faye Taylor stood just 5 feet and 1 inch tall, weighing barely 114 pounds. But those who knew her would tell you her presence filled any room she entered. Her best friend, Angie Cooper, would later remember her voice above all else warm, funny, the kind of voice that felt like coming home after a long journey. Heidi had built her life around the people she loved. She was a mother to her own children, Todd and Alyssa, and had opened her heart to become a mother figure to her partner Shane Nicholas's son, Donovan. At 40 years old, she was also helping to raise grandchildren, with another grandchild on the way. Nothing brought her more joy than her expanding family. The Taylor home was one where love was expressed through action. Heidi cooked elaborate holiday meals and special birthday dinners, each dish prepared with care and intention. She had her quirks. She was always misplacing things, once leaving her car keys in a bag in the freezer for 2 days. But these small imperfections only made her more endearing to those who loved her. She loved sweet tea and the graceful, drooping branches of willow trees. She dreamed of beach vacations and found peace in simple moments. Her family would later say that she had such a strong personality, so full of life, that even now they keep an empty chair for her at family dinners, unable to quite accept that she's gone. Donovan Asher Nicholas was what adults might have called precocious. By age 3, he was speaking with the vocabulary of a 5-year-old. He was intelligent, usually quiet, and had an unusual sensitivity that set him apart from other children. He loved to fish but hated the moment of catching the fish, worried they would suffocate while out of the water. He preferred to dress in black, even dyeing his hair to match. He listened to heavy metal music alongside classical compositions, dismissing country music as being all about beer and tractors. When asked about his preferences, he would say that different is better than normal. But beneath this thoughtful exterior, Donovan was drowning. Around 6th grade, he began experiencing suicidal thoughts. He started cutting himself, hoping that the visible signs of his pain might finally get the attention he desperately needed from the adults in his life. When they discovered his self-harm, instead of the compassion he craved, he received anger and lectures. As he would later tell a court psychologist, he had hoped they would say, "You are worth something and we care." Instead, they just yelled. The responsibility for seeking mental health treatment was left to a 12-year-old boy who was already struggling to understand his own mind. Predictably, he didn't pursue help. He kept his pain hidden, telling virtually no one about what was happening in his life or the dark thoughts that were beginning to consume him. By age 14, these thoughts had evolved into something more sinister. He began exchanging text messages with a school friend who shared his fascination with death and violence. He was thinking about how to kill others, though no one around him realized the depth of his descent. The relationship between Donovan and Heidi was complicated, layered with the challenges that often arise in blended families. Donovan's biological mother was absent from his life, an absence that created a wound he carried with him every day. Heidi had stepped into that role, but for Donovan, she could never quite fill it completely. Shane Nicholas, Donovan's father, traveled extensively for work, leaving Donovan and Heidi alone together for long stretches of time. As the youngest child and the only one still living at home, Donovan became Heidi's primary focus when it came to household discipline and daily interactions. Donovan would later describe their relationship as difficult. He claimed Heidi called him a waste of space, and that she would yell and scream at him for things he had done and things he hadn't done. He felt she treated him unfairly, that she was emotionally neglectful and overly strict. But Heidi's family and friends remember a different story. Yes, she could be firm with Donovan, but no more so than any other parent. Todd Taylor, Heidi's son, would later say that she was rough on him because she knew he had potential to go far in life. Those who knew Heidi best insisted that she loved Donovan deeply and was trying her best to guide a troubled teenager through his difficult years. The truth, as it often is in family dynamics, likely lay somewhere between these two perspectives. But in this case, only one person would survive to tell their version of the story. Somewhere in the midst of his pain and isolation, Donovan discovered a horror story on the internet about a character called Jeff the Killer. Jeff was depicted as an eyelidless maniac with a permanent, carved smile on his pale face. He wore a white shirt and black pants, and he killed with a knife. To Donovan, struggling with feelings of powerlessness and worthlessness, Jeff represented everything he wished he could be. "I fell in love with the story because Jeff the Killer was who I wanted to be," Donovan would later testify. Minus the killing, what started as fascination gradually transformed into something more complex and troubling. Donovan began to experience what he described as another voice in his head, another presence sharing his consciousness. He told a court psychologist that it was like cell division. He grew into two people slowly. At first, he enjoyed this sensation. "I thought it was pretty cool to have someone to talk to that I admired all day," he would later say. But gradually, this other presence became more demanding, more violent. "My bad side started getting bigger and worse," Donovan explained. "I would think about the options and was often torn between them, but generally picked the good side." For months, only two people knew about Jeff's existence in Donovan's mind. But on April 6, 2017, that would change forever. April 6, 2017, began like many other days in the Nicholas household. Shane was out of town for work, leaving Heidi to manage the household and look after Donovan. The 14-year-old came home from 8th grade at Graham Middle School, his shaggy hair and thin frame marking him as just another teenager navigating the awkward years of adolescence. But that afternoon was different. Donovan had dressed specifically for what he planned to do, black pants and a white t-shirt, mimicking the outfit worn by his online obsession. In a grotesque imitation of the character's signature feature, he had used a small blade to make crude cuts around his mouth, attempting to carve the same ghoulish grin that Jeff the Killer was known for. The trigger for what happened next remains unclear. There may have been an argument about Donovan's cell phone. He had been exchanging inappropriate messages with a girlfriend from out of state, and Heidi may have threatened to take the phone away. Or perhaps there was no specific trigger at all. Sometimes violence erupts from the accumulation of small grievances and growing mental illness, rather than any single catalyzing event. What we know for certain is that Donovan positioned himself beneath the front staircase of their two-story farmhouse, hiding in the shadows with a kitchen knife in his hand. He called to Heidi, luring her downstairs to where he waited. What happened next was a horror that would haunt everyone who learned the details. Donovan attacked Heidi with a ferocity that seemed impossible for such a slight teenager. She fought for her life with everything she had, but she was no match for someone who had planned this attack and armed himself for it. The medical examiner would later determine that Heidi sustained at least 62 stab wounds. The knife found its mark on her hands as she tried to defend herself, on her arms as she attempted to flee, on her throat and face and skull. The wounds varied in size and severity, telling the story of a prolonged and desperate struggle. The attack didn't stay in one place. Blood evidence showed that Heidi fought to escape, moving from room to room as Donovan pursued her. The trail of blood told a story of desperation and determination. A small woman refusing to give up, even as her strength ebbed away. In the kitchen, there was a pause in the violence. While Heidi lay wounded on the floor, Donovan calmly got himself a glass of water. This detail, revealed during court testimony, would later strike investigators as particularly chilling, the calculated nature of the break in the midst of such brutality. Heidi managed to flee once more, making it to her bedroom in a final attempt to find safety or perhaps to call for help. But Donovan followed. In her bedroom, he found a firearm in the nightstand. As Heidi lay dying from her multiple stab wounds, he shot her once in the forehead, ensuring that there would be no survival, no recovery, no chance for rescue. During the struggle, some of Heidi's press-on fingernails were lost, later found by investigators as silent witnesses to her fight for life. The wooden-handled kitchen knife was eventually discarded on the dining room table, its terrible work complete. Exhausted and covered in blood, Donovan made his way to the kitchen and dialed 911. The call he made would become crucial evidence in understanding what had happened and what was happening inside his mind. "I swear it wasn't me," he told the dispatcher, his voice stuttering with what sounded like genuine fear and confusion. "It was Jeff. Jeff is inside me." The teenager on the phone sounded terrified, not of being caught, but of something within himself. "I am so scared," he continued. "I didn't want to kill her. I hate Jeff so much. He's going to make me die in prison." His words painted the picture of someone who felt he had been a passenger in his own body during the attack. "I swear it wasn't my fault," he insisted to the dispatcher. When first responders arrived at the scene, they found a crime scene that would stay with them for years. The evidence of violence was everywhere, blood on the floors and walls, the signs of a desperate struggle that had moved through multiple rooms of what should have been a safe family home. And they found Donovan, a slight 14-year-old boy who seemed almost as shocked by what had happened as they were. The investigation into Heidi Taylor's murder was straightforward in some ways and deeply complex in others. There was no question about who had physically committed the crime, Donovan's presence at the scene, his 911 call, and the evidence all pointed directly to him. But understanding why it had happened, and what had been going through Donovan's mind, proved far more challenging. During questioning, he maintained his story about Jeff, the alternate personality that he claimed had taken control of his body and committed the murder. To investigators and prosecutors, this seemed like an elaborate lie, a teenager's attempt to escape responsibility for a horrific crime. But as they dug deeper into Donovan's life, they discovered evidence that suggested his claims might not be entirely fabricated. They found text messages and journal entries that showed Donovan writing and acting as though someone else was in control. There were communications where he seemed to be speaking as Jeff, using different language patterns and expressing thoughts that seemed foreign to his usual personality. Mental health professionals were brought in to evaluate Donovan, and their findings would become central to everything that followed. The question wasn't just whether Donovan had committed the crime. That was never in dispute. The question was whether a 14-year-old boy experiencing severe mental illness should be treated as a juvenile in need of help, or as an adult deserving of punishment. 3 psychologists evaluated Donovan after his arrest, and their findings painted a complex picture of a deeply troubled young man. Dr. Daniel Hrinko, one of the evaluators, diagnosed Donovan with 4 of the 5 key symptoms consistent with dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder. Unlike typical DID cases, Donovan claimed he remained aware during the episodes when Jeff took control, which was unusual for the condition. Still, Hrinko found evidence supporting Donovan's claims, including the text messages and behavioral changes that preceded the murder. Dr. Benjamin Hendrickson diagnosed Donovan with depressive disorder, recognizing the severe mental illness but categorizing it differently. A third psychologist, Dr. Cara Marciani, found that Donovan did not suffer from symptoms severe enough to constitute a serious or chronic mental illness. This disagreement among experts would become a crucial element in the legal battle that followed. Did Donovan suffer from a genuine mental illness that impaired his ability to control his actions? Or was he a manipulative teenager who had crafted an elaborate defense to escape punishment? The experts agreed on one thing: Donovan was deeply unwell at the time of the murder. All 3 found disturbing behaviors, aberrant thought patterns, and mood disturbances that were symptoms of psychiatric disorders. The question was how to respond to that illness in the context of such a horrific crime. In Ohio, 14 is the youngest age at which a child can be tried as an adult for murder. Prosecutor Kevin Talabai made the difficult decision to seek this transfer, arguing that the juvenile system's resources, which would have ended when Donovan turned 21, were insufficient for such a serious crime. The juvenile court judge, Lori Reisinger, had to weigh complex factors in making this decision. Could Donovan be rehabilitated within the juvenile system? Was public safety at risk if he received only 7 years of intervention instead of the decades-long sentence possible in adult court? Crucially, Judge Reisinger set aside testimony from a state youth services official who had indicated that sufficient mental health resources would be available to treat Donovan in the juvenile system. Dr. Hrinko had also concluded that Donovan could be effectively treated as a juvenile. Despite this professional opinion supporting juvenile treatment, Judge Reisinger decided to transfer the case to adult court. This decision would set in motion a legal battle that would last years and ultimately reach the Ohio Supreme Court. The transfer meant that Donovan, at 14 years old, would face the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. He became one of the youngest children prosecuted as an adult in Ohio in the last decade, an outlier even in a system that rarely tries children so young as adults. Once in adult court, Donovan's attorneys attempted to mount an insanity defense, arguing that his mental illness prevented him from understanding that his actions were wrong. Under Ohio law, this is a difficult standard to meet. It's not enough to be mentally ill. The illness must have prevented the defendant from knowing their actions were illegal or morally wrong. Adult court judge Nick Silvaggio ultimately rejected the insanity plea. While he acknowledged that Donovan's mental state was a legitimate question for the jury, he found that the evidence didn't support a complete lack of understanding about right and wrong. Donovan had testified that Jeff fully believes that murder is 100% okay, and that while Jeff knew murder was illegal, he did not believe that it was wrong. But the court determined that this wasn't sufficient to meet the legal standard for insanity. Unable to pursue the insanity defense, Donovan's attorneys argued that he had been in a very, very deep trance during the attack, that Jeff had taken control of his body while his consciousness was essentially absent. It was a difficult argument to make to a jury who had heard the gruesome details of the crime. The trial took place in 2018, when Donovan was 16 years old. The prosecution, led by Kevin Talabai, painted a picture of a sullen teenager consumed by violent fantasies and obsessed with an out-of-state girlfriend. They argued that his rage had been sparked by Heidi's attempt to discipline him by taking away his cell phone due to inappropriate messages he'd been sending. The defense maintained that Donovan was severely mentally ill, and that the alternate personality of Jeff had committed the murder while Donovan was essentially trapped within his own mind, unable to control his actions. The jury heard testimony about the brutal nature of the attack, the 62 stab wounds, the chase through the house, the final gunshot to Heidi's forehead. They learned about Donovan's 911 call and his claims about Jeff. They heard from mental health experts with differing opinions about his psychological state. On July 18, 2018, just 2 weeks after Donovan's 16th birthday, the jury found him guilty of aggravated murder and murder, both with firearm specifications that enhanced the sentence. Judge Silvaggio sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 28 years. In his sentencing decision, Judge Silvaggio expressed skepticism about Donovan's claims, concluding that the self-reported emergence of the alternate personality was actually created and promoted by the defendant in order to rationalize and allocate blame for the homicidal act. Donovan's legal team, led by attorneys Tim Hackett and Catherine Sato, began a lengthy appeals process, arguing that he should never have been tried as an adult in the first place. They contended that Judge Reisinger had made a crucial error in ignoring evidence that Donovan could be successfully treated within the juvenile system. The case wound its way through the Ohio court system, with Donovan's attorneys arguing that the original transfer decision had been flawed. They maintained that a 14-year-old boy, regardless of the severity of his crime, deserved the chance for rehabilitation that the juvenile system was designed to provide. The appeals process took years, during which Donovan remained incarcerated. His attorneys noted that during his time in custody, he had no violent incidents whatsoever. He received his high school diploma while behind bars and participated in therapy and other treatment programs. Meanwhile, Heidi's family waited for closure, believing that justice had been served with Donovan's conviction and life sentence. The appeals felt like a reopening of wounds that had barely begun to heal. In December 2022, the Ohio Supreme Court issued a narrow 4-3 decision that would change everything. The majority ruled that Judge Reisinger had indeed made an error in transferring Donovan's case to adult court. She had improperly ignored evidence about his potential for rehabilitation within the juvenile system. Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor wrote in the majority opinion that without this misperception, the likelihood favored trying to save Donovan rather than simply punishing him. The court sent the case back to juvenile court, effectively vacating his adult conviction. The 3 dissenting justices warned that this was overreach and cautioned about the consequences of such a decision. They worried that no one is or can be prepared for the result of releasing someone who had committed such a violent crime. The ruling caught Heidi's family completely off guard. After years of believing that justice had been served, they suddenly faced the reality that Donovan would be released on his 21st birthday with almost no restrictions. On July 9, 2023, Donovan Asher Nicholas walked free from an Ohio youth facility. He was 21 years old, having spent nearly 7 years in custody for a crime he committed when he was 14. The irony of his release was that it was Todd Taylor, Heidi's son, who drove Donovan and his father home from the facility. Shane Nicholas had used Todd's car to pick up his son, creating an impossibly awkward situation for the young man whose mother had been murdered. During the 15-minute drive, Donovan sat in the back seat with a box containing his belongings, saying nothing. Finally, Todd told him, "I don't want to hear your name unless it's for getting Citizen of the Year." Donovan responded that he understood how Todd felt and hoped that someday they could put the tragedy behind them. Then he began to cry. Todd's response was both compassionate and final. "As much as I love you and as much as I care about you, it's never going to happen." Donovan's release came with very few restrictions. Unlike many violent offenders, he wasn't required to wear an ankle monitor or check in regularly with probation officers. The only significant limitation was that he couldn't purchase firearms in the state of Ohio. His attorneys reported that he was working and receiving continued mental health treatment, though confidentiality laws prevented them from discussing the specifics of his care or whether he continued to struggle with the alternate personality that had allegedly driven him to murder. At his final juvenile court hearing in June 2023, Donovan spoke about how therapy had helped him and how he had found faith in God. He told the court that he couldn't express how different he was from the troubled 14-year-old who had committed the crime. He expressed hope that he could somehow ease his family's pain. But for Heidi's family, his words offered little comfort. They had lost a woman who was the center of their world, and no amount of rehabilitation or growth could bring her back. The case of Donovan Nicholas and the murder of Heidi Taylor raises disturbing questions about how the justice system handles children who commit unspeakable acts. Is a 14-year-old capable of the kind of evil that deserves life imprisonment? Or is even the most violent child still a child, deserving of the chance for rehabilitation and redemption? For Heidi's daughter, Alyssa Nicholas, who had once considered Donovan her brother, the answers aren't simple. She obtained a protective order for herself and her 3 daughters, ensuring that Donovan can't contact them. When asked what she thought was fair treatment for the young man who killed her mother, she paused for a long time before answering. "I don't know," she said finally. "If he could get treatment and public safety could be guaranteed, then, he has a life to live as well. But it definitely would not be a part of mine." Todd Taylor struggles with different emotions. The anger is still there, burning as hot as it did in 2017. "I don't see how a person can come back from that and be a good person," he says. He doesn't trust that any amount of therapy or rehabilitation can truly change someone who is capable of such violence. But underneath the anger is something more complex, a love for the boy he once knew, mixed with an inability to reconcile that boy with the person who killed his mother. "The more I try to figure out what's going on in that kid's head, the more I go crazy," he admits. Heidi Taylor's case highlights the tension between justice and mercy, between punishment and rehabilitation, especially when the perpetrator is a child. Since 2021, Ohio has banned life sentences without parole for juvenile offenders, recognizing that children's brains are still developing and that even those who commit serious crimes may be capable of change. Advocates for juvenile justice reform argue that simply throwing a child away doesn't serve true justice, which should focus on healing and making things right. They point to research showing that children's brains don't fully mature until their mid-20s, particularly the areas responsible for impulse control and decision-making. But victims' families often see these arguments as abstract theories that ignore the very real pain and loss they've experienced. For them, the focus on the perpetrator's potential for redemption can feel like a betrayal of their loved one's memory. The question of whether Donovan truly suffered from dissociative identity disorder remains unanswered. DID is a rare condition, occurring in less than 1% of the population according to mental health experts. It typically develops as a response to severe childhood trauma, as the mind creates separate identities to cope with unbearable experiences. People with DID are generally more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. The condition itself doesn't predict violent behavior, though like anyone else, those who suffer from it are capable of harming others under certain circumstances. The experts who evaluated Donovan couldn't reach a consensus. Some found evidence supporting his claims, while others remained skeptical. The text messages and journal entries that seemed to show different personalities could have been genuine expressions of a fractured mind, or they could have been the elaborate construction of an intelligent teenager seeking to build a defense. Dr. Hrinko, who was most supportive of Donovan's claims, acknowledged that there was a possibility the boy had simply made up Jeff, but he was inclined to believe the claims based on the evidence he reviewed and his interactions with Donovan. Those who loved Heidi Taylor work to ensure that her memory isn't overshadowed by the circumstances of her death. Her best friend, Angie Cooper, remembers her infectious laughter and the way she made everyone feel welcome in her home. Her children remember a mother who would go to extraordinary lengths to provide for her family. They keep her traditions alive, the special holiday meals, the birthday celebrations, the way she showed love through cooking and care. They tell stories about her quirks and her kindness, trying to preserve the fullness of who she was beyond the tragedy of how she died. But the case has also brought unwanted attention. True crime enthusiasts online have dissected every detail of the murder. Podcasts have featured the case, and social media content creators have mined it for views. The 911 call has been listened to by tens of thousands of people seeking entertainment in a family's darkest moment. For Heidi's family, this attention feels like a violation, a continued exploitation of their grief. "It's like the thing is just haunting me," Alyssa says. "Like you just can't get away from it now." They want people to remember that this wasn't just a story. It was their reality, their loss, their ongoing pain. As we reach the end of the story, we're left with more questions than answers. Was Donovan Nicholas a troubled child who needed help, whose mental illness drove him to an act of unimaginable violence? Or was he a manipulative teenager who used claims of mental illness to escape responsibility for a calculated murder? Can someone who commits such a brutal act at 14 truly be rehabilitated by 21? Does the juvenile justice system have the tools and resources to address cases this extreme? And how do we balance the possibility of redemption with the need for justice and public safety? The case also raises questions about how we recognize and respond to mental illness in children. Donovan showed warning signs, the depression, the self-harm, the suicidal thoughts, but he didn't receive the help he needed. Would earlier intervention have prevented this tragedy? Or were his problems too deep, too complex for any system to address? We may never know the complete truth about what happened in Donovan's mind on April 6, 2017. Mental illness, especially conditions like dissociative identity disorder, remains poorly understood even by experts. The line between genuine illness and manipulation can be incredibly difficult to discern, particularly when the stakes are so high. Today, Donovan Nicholas is somewhere in Ohio trying to build a life as a free man. His attorneys say he's working and continuing to receive mental health treatment. They express confidence that he's on the right path, though they acknowledge that his reintegration won't be easy or straightforward. He carries with him the weight of what he did on that April afternoon, whether it was truly him or some other aspect of his fractured psyche. He must live with the knowledge that his actions destroyed not only Heidi's life, but also devastated everyone who loved her. Heidi's family continues to grieve, to remember, and to wonder what might have been. They've learned to live with questions that will never be answered and a loss that will never fully heal. The case serves as a reminder of how mental illness can remain hidden until it explodes into violence, how families can live together while remaining strangers to each other's pain, and how the justice system struggles to respond appropriately when children commit adult crimes. It's a story without easy answers or clean resolutions, the kind that stays with you long after the details fade. In the quiet farmlands of Ohio, in a house where love and violence once collided, the echoes of that April day continue to reverberate through the lives of everyone touched by this tragedy. And somewhere in that complexity, in the space between justice and mercy, between punishment and redemption, we're left to wonder, what would true healing look like for everyone involved? And is such healing even possible after something so devastating? The story of Heidi Taylor and Donovan Nicholas reminds us that true crime isn't just about the mystery or the investigation. It's about real people whose lives were forever changed by moments of unthinkable violence. Behind every case are families who must find ways to continue living, loving, and hoping despite their unimaginable losses. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll think about the complexity of human nature, the mystery of the mind, and the delicate balance between seeking justice and offering compassion. Some stories don't have neat endings, and some questions will never be answered. But in remembering these stories with thoughtfulness and respect, we honor both the victims and our shared humanity. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we journey back to Nashville, Tennessee, in the late winter of 1988, to explore a case that would shake the local community and leave lasting scars on all those who knew the victims. This is the story of Angela Clay and her 2 young daughters, a tragedy born from jealousy, rage, and the darkest impulses of human nature. In the spring of 1988, Nashville was experiencing the typical transition from winter's grip to the promise of warmer days ahead. The city hummed with its usual blend of country music dreams and working-class reality. Among its residents was 29-year-old Angela Clay, a woman trying to build a stable life for herself and her 2 daughters in South Nashville. Angela wasn't originally from Tennessee. Like many who found themselves in Music City, she had come seeking something better, a fresh start, perhaps, or simply the opportunity to provide for her family. She lived in a modest apartment complex, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business and children played in the shared courtyards, while their parents worked to make ends meet. Her daughters were the center of her world. 9-year-old Latoya, the elder of the two, had inherited her mother's warm smile and was known in the neighborhood as a bright, curious child who excelled in school. She was at that wonderful age where everything seemed possible, where dreams were still intact and the harsh realities of the world hadn't yet intruded upon her young life. 6-year-old Lakeisha, sometimes spelled Lakeisha in court documents, was the baby of the family, full of the energy and wonder that only very young children possess. She had been born on March 8, 1982, making her barely 6 years old when the events of this story unfolded. The Clay family lived in apartment B of their building, a small but comfortable space that Angela had worked hard to maintain. She was a single mother, facing all the challenges that such a position entailed in the late 1980s. The social safety net was different then, more limited, and single mothers often found themselves struggling not just financially, but socially as well. Angela, however, was determined to provide stability for her girls. Those who knew Angela described her as a devoted mother who put her children's needs above her own. She worked steady jobs to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. In the evenings, she could often be seen helping Latoya with homework or playing with little Lakeisha in the apartment courtyard. Neighbors remembered her as someone who kept to herself but was always polite, always trying to do right by her daughters. But like many single mothers, Angela also craved companionship. She wanted someone to share her life with, someone who might help shoulder the burdens of raising 2 children alone. It was this very human desire for love and partnership that would ultimately lead to tragedy. Into Angela's life came Byron Lewis Black, a man whose name would become forever linked with one of Nashville's most heinous crimes. Born on March 23, 1956, Byron was 32 years old when he entered Angela's world, a man with a troubled past that should have served as a warning of the darkness he was capable of. Byron was not a stranger to the criminal justice system. In fact, at the time he met Angela, he was serving time for a previous shooting incident. However, he wasn't behind bars in the traditional sense. Instead, he was part of a work release program, one of those initiatives designed to help prisoners transition back into society by allowing them to maintain employment while serving their sentences. During the day, he would work at his assigned job, but at night, he was supposed to return to the correctional facility. The work release program represented society's attempt at rehabilitation, the hope that by maintaining some connection to normal life and employment, criminals might be less likely to reoffend once their sentences were complete. For Byron Black, however, this program provided something else entirely. It gave him the freedom and opportunity to manipulate and control those around him. It was during this period of work release that Byron met Angela Clay. The exact circumstances of their meeting have been lost to time, but what is clear is that a relationship developed between them. Angela, perhaps lonely and seeking stability for herself and her daughters, may have seen in Byron someone who could fill the void in her life. She might have been drawn to his charm, for many dangerous men possess an ability to present themselves as desirable partners, at least initially. Byron, for his part, seems to have viewed Angela and her situation as an opportunity. Here was a vulnerable single mother with her own apartment, someone he could stay with during his work release periods, someone who might provide him with the comforts of home life while he served his sentence. But Byron Black was not the kind of man who understood healthy relationships or mutual respect. Instead, he approached relationships as power dynamics to be controlled and exploited. Those familiar with domestic violence patterns would recognize in Byron's behavior the classic signs of an abuser. He likely started with charm and attention, making Angela feel special and wanted. He probably presented himself as someone who could help with her daughters, perhaps even as a potential father figure for Latoya and Lakeisha. But beneath this facade lay something much darker. Byron Black was a man consumed by jealousy and possessiveness. In his mind, Angela belonged to him, and any threat to that possession, real or imagined, triggered violent rage. He was the type of person who viewed women not as independent human beings with their own thoughts, desires, and rights, but as objects to be controlled and owned. As winter turned to spring in 1988, the relationship between Angela Clay and Byron Black began to show its true nature. What may have started as a source of companionship and hope for Angela gradually transformed into something much more sinister. Byron's presence in her life became less of a blessing and more of a burden, less of a partnership and more of a prison. Byron's jealousy manifested in various ways, as it typically does in abusive relationships. He likely questioned Angela about her whereabouts when he wasn't around, demanded to know who she spoke with, and became suspicious of any male contact she might have had. He probably tried to isolate her from friends and family members, convincing her that he was the only person she could trust, the only one who truly cared about her and her daughters. The children, Latoya and Lakeisha, found themselves caught in an increasingly tense situation. While they may not have understood all the adult dynamics at play, children are remarkably perceptive when it comes to sensing danger and hostility. They likely felt the change in their home's atmosphere, noticed their mother's increasing anxiety, and perhaps even experienced Byron's controlling behavior firsthand. Angela, trapped in the classic cycle of domestic abuse, probably found herself walking on eggshells, trying to manage Byron's moods and protect her daughters from his anger. She may have begun to realize that the relationship was not what she had hoped for, that Byron was not the stable partner she had been seeking. Perhaps she started to consider ways to end the relationship, to remove Byron from her life and reclaim the peaceful home she had worked so hard to create for her children. In the minds of men like Byron Black, any threat to their control represents an intolerable challenge to their dominance. If Angela had indeed begun to pull away, if she had shown signs of wanting to end their relationship, Byron's jealousy and possessiveness would have intensified exponentially. In his twisted worldview, if he couldn't have Angela on his terms, then no one could have her at all. The specific triggers that led to the events of March 28, 1988, may never be fully understood. Perhaps Angela had finally worked up the courage to tell Byron the relationship was over. Maybe she had been seen talking to another man, or perhaps Byron had simply imagined some slight or betrayal that existed only in his paranoid mind. Whatever the immediate cause, the underlying dynamic was clear. Byron Black had reached the point where his need to control had evolved into a desire to destroy. The date March 28, 1988, would forever be etched in the memory of those who loved Angela Clay and her daughters. It was a Monday evening, the kind of ordinary weeknight when families across America were settling into their routines, homework, dinner, perhaps some television before bedtime. For the Clay family, it should have been just another peaceful evening in their South Nashville apartment. But Byron Black had other plans. During the investigation that would follow, prosecutors would piece together the evidence of what happened that night. Byron had been staying at Angela's apartment during his work release periods, a violation of the program's rules that he had been getting away with. On this particular evening, something inside him snapped. Whether it was jealousy, rage, or simply the culmination of his controlling obsession, Byron made the decision to commit an act of unthinkable violence. The weapon he chose was a gun, a tool that would allow him to quickly and efficiently destroy the 3 lives that had become the focus of his twisted attention. Byron entered the apartment that evening with murder in his heart, carrying with him the instrument of death that would soon shatter the peace of the Clay household forever. Angela was in her bedroom, likely preparing for bed or perhaps already asleep. The day had probably been like any other work, caring for her daughters, the routine responsibilities of single motherhood that filled her life. She had no way of knowing that Byron Black was about to make the most horrific decision of his life, one that would end her world and devastate everyone who knew and loved her family. The attack began in Angela's bedroom. Byron shot Angela once in the head while she slept, and she died within minutes. The brutality of this act speaks to the cold-blooded nature of Byron's violence. This was not a crime of passion in the heat of an argument, but a calculated execution of a defenseless woman who had trusted him enough to let him into her home. 9-year-old Latoya was also in the bedroom, perhaps having come to sleep with her mother as children sometimes do. Latoya was shot in the neck and chest from about 24 inches away. The fact that Byron was willing to murder a child, a little girl who had never done anything to harm anyone, reveals the depths of his depravity. Latoya had her whole life ahead of her, friendships to form, lessons to learn, dreams to pursue. All of that potential was snuffed out in an instant by a man who saw her only as an obstacle to be eliminated. But Byron's rampage wasn't finished. 6-year-old Lakeisha, the baby of the family, was in another bedroom. Perhaps she had been awakened by the gunshots, confused and terrified by the sounds of violence in her home. Or maybe she was still asleep, unaware of the horror that had already claimed her mother and sister. Whatever her state of awareness, little Lakeisha became Byron's final victim that night. The child was found lying face down in another room, having suffered multiple gunshot wounds. The methodical nature of Byron's actions that night, moving from room to room, ensuring that all 3 family members were dead, demonstrates that this was not an impulsive act but a deliberate massacre. He had made the conscious decision to eliminate the entire Clay family, to destroy not just Angela but her children as well. After completing his horrific work, Byron Black fled the scene. He left behind 3 bodies, 3 lives cut tragically short, and a crime scene that would haunt the investigators who would soon arrive. The apartment that had been Angela's sanctuary, the home she had worked so hard to provide for her daughters, had become a house of death. The Clay family's absence from their normal routines didn't go unnoticed for long. In tight-knit communities like the one where Angela lived, people looked out for each other. And when someone familiar suddenly disappeared from sight, concerned friends and relatives took notice. The following evening, after police were called to the South Nashville apartment by concerned relatives, they found a scene that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. The responding officers, trained to handle all manner of emergency calls, were nonetheless unprepared for the level of brutality they encountered in apartment B. Angela was found shot to death in her bed. Her older daughter, Latoya, was dead in the bedroom with her, shot through the neck and chest. The other child, Lakeisha, was lying face down in another room, having suffered multiple gunshot wounds. The crime scene told a story of methodical violence, of a killer who had moved through the apartment with deadly purpose. The investigators who processed the scene were experienced professionals, but the murder of children always affects law enforcement officers in profound ways. These were not hardened criminals or adults involved in dangerous lifestyles. These were innocent victims whose only crime had been trusting the wrong person. The sight of little Lakeisha and Latoya, their lives ended so violently and prematurely, would stay with the investigators for years to come. Evidence collection began immediately. The apartment was treated as the crime scene it had become, with every detail photographed, every piece of potential evidence carefully documented and preserved. The locations of the bodies, the trajectory of the bullets, the absence of signs of forced entry, all of these factors would become crucial in building the case against whoever was responsible for this massacre. But even as the physical evidence was being collected, investigators were already developing their primary suspect. Angela's family members who had called for the wellness check were able to provide information about Byron Black and his relationship with Angela. They described a man who had become increasingly possessive and controlling, someone who had made Angela's life more difficult rather than easier. The fact that Byron was supposed to be in a correctional facility during non-working hours, but had been staying at Angela's apartment was immediately flagged as a violation of his work release terms. When authorities attempted to locate Byron after the discovery of the bodies, he was nowhere to be found. His absence from his required check-in at the correctional facility, combined with his intimate connection to the victims, made him the obvious prime suspect. With Byron Black identified as the primary suspect in the triple murder, law enforcement agencies mobilized to track him down. This wasn't just a case of a missing person. This was an active manhunt for someone who had demonstrated his willingness to kill without mercy, including innocent children. The danger he posed to the community was immense. Byron's familiarity with the criminal justice system may have helped him initially evade capture, but it also meant that his methods and likely hiding spots were somewhat predictable. Investigators began checking with his known associates, former employers, and family members. They issued alerts to law enforcement agencies throughout Tennessee and neighboring states, recognizing that Byron might attempt to flee to another jurisdiction. Meanwhile, the forensic investigation continued at the crime scene and in the laboratory. Ballistics experts examined the bullets and shell casings found in the apartment, working to determine exactly what type of weapon had been used and potentially trace it back to its source. Fingerprint analysts processed the apartment for any physical evidence Byron might have left behind. Blood spatter experts analyzed the patterns of violence to reconstruct exactly what had happened in each room. The autopsy reports provided heartbreaking details about the final moments of Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha Clay. Each bullet wound was documented, each trajectory analyzed. The medical examiner's findings would later be crucial in court, providing the precise cause of death for each victim and helping to establish the timeline of the murders. As investigators dug deeper into Byron's background, a disturbing pattern emerged. His previous conviction for shooting someone should have been a red flag, an indication of his propensity for gun violence. The work release program that had given him access to Angela's apartment was designed as a rehabilitative tool, but in this case, it had enabled a dangerous criminal to commit an even more serious offense. The manhunt for Byron Black extended beyond Tennessee's borders as days turned into weeks. His photograph was distributed to police departments across the Southeast, and investigators followed up on every reported sighting, every tip from the public. The pressure to apprehend him was intense, not just because of the heinous nature of his crimes, but because of the ongoing threat he represented to public safety. Byron Black's freedom as a fugitive was relatively short-lived. The combined resources of multiple law enforcement agencies, along with the public attention generated by the brutal triple murder, made it difficult for him to remain hidden indefinitely. When he was finally apprehended, it marked the beginning of the legal process that would seek justice for Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha Clay. The arrest of Byron Black was a relief to the Nashville community, which had lived in fear knowing that someone capable of such violence was on the loose. But for the family members and friends of the victims, Byron's capture was only the first step in a long journey towards some semblance of justice and closure. The defendant, Byron Lewis Black, was convicted of the triple murders of Angela Clay, age 29, and her two daughters, LaToya, age 9, and Lakeisha, age 6. The trial that followed would be a lengthy and emotionally draining process for everyone involved, particularly for the surviving family members who had to relive the tragedy through testimony and evidence presentation. The prosecution's case was built around the overwhelming evidence of Byron's guilt. His relationship with Angela, his violation of work release terms by staying at her apartment, his flight after the murders, and the physical evidence found at the crime scene all pointed to him as the perpetrator. Prosecutors portrayed Byron as a jealous, controlling man who had murdered Angela and her daughters rather than lose control over them. The defense faced an uphill battle given the strength of the evidence against their client. Byron's legal team likely explored various strategies, perhaps questioning the handling of evidence, suggesting alternative theories of the crime, or arguing that while Byron might have been responsible for Angela's death, someone else had killed the children. But the evidence was too comprehensive, too damning, for any of these approaches to gain traction with the jury. During the trial, the jury heard testimony from investigators, forensic experts, family members, and neighbors. They saw photographs of the crime scene, listened to detailed descriptions of the victim's injuries, and learned about the timeline of events leading up to the murders. The prosecution painted a picture of a man so consumed by jealousy and the need to control that he was willing to commit the ultimate act of violence. Following a trial, Byron Lewis Black, born March 23, 1956, was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The jury's verdict represented their conclusion that Byron had not only killed Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha, but that he had done so with premeditation and deliberation, that these were not spontaneous acts of violence but carefully planned murders. With Byron Black's guilt established beyond a reasonable doubt, the focus of the legal proceedings shifted to the question of punishment. In capital cases like this one, where multiple murders have been committed, the prosecution typically seeks the death penalty, arguing that the crimes are so heinous that the ultimate punishment is appropriate. He received life sentences for the murders of Angela Clay, count 1 of the indictment, and LaToya Clay, count 3 of the indictment, and a capital punishment for the passing of Lakeisha Clay. This sentencing structure reflects the complex considerations that go into death penalty cases. The decision to sentence Byron to death for the murder of 6-year-old Lakeisha while giving him life sentences for the murders of Angela and Latoya likely reflected the jury's particular horror at the killing of such a young child. Lakeisha was barely 6 years old, a kindergartner with her whole life ahead of her. The jury may have felt that the murder of someone so young and vulnerable represented an especially aggravated form of the crime that warranted the most severe punishment available under Tennessee law. The sentencing phase of a capital trial involves presentation of evidence about aggravating and mitigating factors. Aggravating factors might include the defendant's prior criminal history, the particularly brutal nature of the crimes, or the vulnerability of the victims. Mitigating factors could include the defendant's background, mental health issues, or expressions of remorse. In Byron's case, the prosecution likely emphasized several aggravating factors. The fact that there were multiple victims, the young age of 2 of the victims, the domestic violence context of the crimes, and Byron's previous conviction for shooting someone. These factors painted a picture of someone who represented an ongoing danger to society, someone for whom life imprisonment might not be sufficient punishment. The defense, meanwhile, would have searched for any mitigating factors that might spare Byron's life. They might have presented evidence about his upbringing, any mental health issues, or substance abuse problems that could have contributed to his violent behavior. However, given the calculated nature of the murders and Byron's prior criminal history, finding compelling mitigation would have been challenging. The jury's decision to impose the death penalty for one of the 3 murders reflected their judgment that Byron Black had committed crimes so terrible that he forfeited his right to life. This decision would set in motion a lengthy appeals process that would continue for decades. Following his sentencing, Byron Black joined the population of Tennessee's death row, beginning what would be a decades-long wait for his execution. Death row is a unique environment within the prison system, housing individuals who have been sentenced to death, while their cases work their way through the lengthy appeals process that characterizes capital punishment in the United States. For Byron, life on death row meant years of confinement in a small cell, with limited human contact and restricted activities. Death row inmates typically spend 22 to 23 hours per day in their cells, with minimal opportunities for recreation, work, or social interaction. This isolation is partly for security reasons. Death row inmates are considered among the most dangerous in the prison system, but it also reflects the punitive nature of death row confinement. During his time on death row, Byron's case continued to move through the appeals courts. In capital cases, appeals are not optional, they are mandatory, reflecting society's recognition that the death penalty is irreversible and that every possible legal avenue must be explored before an execution can proceed. These appeals examine various aspects of the case, from the adequacy of trial counsel to the appropriateness of the sentence to potential constitutional violations. The appeals process in capital cases is notoriously lengthy, often taking 20 years or more to complete. This delay serves multiple purposes. It ensures that all legal issues are thoroughly examined, it provides time for new evidence to potentially emerge, and it allows for the possibility that changing legal standards might affect the case. For families of victims, however, this lengthy process can be frustrating, extending their pain and preventing them from achieving the closure they seek. Throughout his years on death row, Byron Black's case was reviewed by various state and federal courts. His attorneys raised numerous issues on appeal, as is standard in capital cases. They might have argued that his trial counsel was ineffective, that his sentence was disproportionate to his crimes, or that new legal precedents required reconsideration of his case. One issue that would become particularly significant in Byron's case was the question of intellectual disability. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Atkins v. Virginia that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. This ruling led to renewed examinations of the mental capacities of death row inmates across the country, including Byron Black. Despite IQ concerns, Byron Black remained on Tennessee's death row, but the question of his intellectual capacity became a significant issue in the later stages of his case. The Atkins decision had established that individuals with intellectual disabilities could not be executed, but determining who qualifies for this protection has proven to be a complex legal and medical question. Intellectual disability is typically defined by 3 criteria: significantly sub-average intellectual functioning, usually an IQ of 70 or below, deficits in adaptive behavior, and onset before age 18. However, measuring these factors decades after the fact, particularly in individuals who have spent years in the restrictive environment of death row, presents significant challenges. Byron's attorneys likely presented evidence of his intellectual limitations, possibly including IQ test results, testimony about his educational struggles, and examples of adaptive functioning deficits throughout his life. They may have argued that these limitations affected his understanding of right and wrong at the time of the crimes, or that they made him less culpable for his actions. The state, in response, would have countered with evidence that Byron's intellectual functioning was adequate for him to understand the nature and consequences of his actions. They might have pointed to his ability to plan and execute the murders, his attempts to evade capture, and his functioning during the work release program as evidence that any intellectual limitations were not severe enough to exempt him from execution. Courts examining intellectual disability claims in capital cases must walk a fine line. They must ensure that truly intellectually disabled individuals are not executed, while also preventing defendants from manipulating the system by feigning or exaggerating cognitive impairments. This requires careful examination of historical records, expert testimony, and objective testing. The question of Byron's intellectual capacity added another layer of complexity to his case, extending the appeals process and raising questions about the appropriateness of executing him. However, ultimately, the courts determined that any intellectual limitations Byron might have had were not severe enough to exempt him from the death penalty. As Byron Black's execution date approached in 2025, a new complication arose that would generate significant controversy. Experts warned Black's heart implant could shock him repeatedly during lethal injection, but the state killed him without deactivating it. This medical issue raised serious questions about the humanity of the execution method and whether proceeding with the execution under these circumstances would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Cardiac implants, such as pacemakers and defibrillators, are designed to regulate heart rhythm and can deliver electrical shocks to restart a stopped heart. During the lethal injection process, these devices might malfunction or deliver painful shocks as the inmate's body systems begin to shut down. Medical experts argued that this could cause unnecessary suffering beyond what is inherent in any execution method. Byron's legal team seized upon this issue as grounds for a stay of execution, arguing that proceeding with the lethal injection without first deactivating his cardiac device would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. They sought intervention from the courts to either halt the execution or require the state to take steps to prevent the potential complications. The state of Tennessee, however, maintained that the execution should proceed as scheduled. Officials argued that the medical concerns were speculative and that delaying the execution would cause additional suffering to the victims' families, who had already waited decades for justice to be carried out. This medical controversy highlighted the ongoing debates surrounding the death penalty and execution methods. Even supporters of capital punishment generally agree that executions should be carried out in the most humane manner possible, but determining what constitutes humane in the context of state-sanctioned killing remains a source of ongoing legal and ethical debate. The cardiac implant issue was just one of several last-minute appeals and motions filed on Byron's behalf. His attorneys also continued to raise concerns about his intellectual capacity and argued that executing him would serve no legitimate penological purpose. They presented evidence of his positive behavior while on death row and argued that life imprisonment would adequately serve society's interests in punishment and deterrence. As Byron Black's execution date approached, the voices of Angela Clay's surviving family members became an important part of the story. Belle's sister, Angela Clay, and her daughters LaToya, 9, and Lakeisha, 6, were gunned down inside their Nashville home, and the pain of their loss had never fully healed. Family members spoke about the decades of pain they had endured, the birthdays and holidays forever marked by absence, the graduations and weddings that LaToya and Lakeisha would never experience. They described the ongoing trauma of losing not just Angela, but 2 innocent children whose lives were just beginning. The extended appeals process had been particularly difficult for the family. While they understood the legal necessity of thoroughly reviewing death penalty cases, each appeal meant reliving the trauma, revisiting the details of the murders, and continuing to live with the uncertainty of when or even if justice would finally be served. Some family members expressed their desire to see Byron's execution carried out, viewing it as the appropriate punishment for his crimes and the only way to achieve some measure of closure. They spoke of the particular pain of having the children murdered, emphasizing that LaToya and Lakeisha had been completely innocent victims who deserved to grow up and live full lives. The family's statements also highlighted the ripple effects of violent crime. The murders hadn't just taken 3 lives. They had forever changed the lives of everyone who loved Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends all bore the weight of the loss. All carried the scars of that terrible night in March 1988. Their voices served as a reminder of why the criminal justice system exists, and not just to punish wrongdoers, but to vindicate the rights of victims and provide some measure of justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. As August 2025 approached, Byron Black's legal team made their final attempts to save his life. They filed emergency petitions with various courts, sought intervention from the governor, and made last-minute appeals to prison officials. Each of these efforts was met with denial, as the legal system moved inexorably toward the scheduled execution date. Advocates delivered petitions urging Governor Bill Lee to halt Byron Black's execution, but these pleas fell on deaf ears. The governor, who had the power to commute Byron's sentence or grant a stay of execution, declined to intervene. This decision reflected the state's determination to carry out the sentence that had been imposed decades earlier. The final days before an execution are always intense, filled with last-minute legal maneuvering, media attention, and emotional preparation by all parties involved. For Byron, these were likely days of reflection on his life, his crimes, and his impending death. Whether he felt remorse for his actions, fear about his fate, or simply resignation to his circumstances, his inner thoughts remained private. Prison officials prepared for the execution with methodical precision. The death chamber was tested and prepared. Witnesses were notified, and security measures were heightened. Executions are complex logistical operations that require coordination among numerous agencies and officials. Media attention intensified as the execution date approached. Reporters sought interviews with family members, legal experts, and death penalty advocates on both sides of the issue. Byron's case had become not just about his individual crimes, but about broader questions regarding the death penalty, intellectual disability, and the treatment of inmates with medical conditions. On August 8, 2025, more than 37 years after he murdered Angela Clay and her 2 daughters, Byron Lewis Black was executed by lethal injection at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. Black became the 28th inmate executed in the U.S. this year, marking the end of his decades-long journey through the criminal justice system. The execution itself was not without controversy. Attorney says Byron Black was tortured in painful execution, with his legal representatives arguing that the state's failure to deactivate his cardiac implant had caused unnecessary suffering during the lethal injection process. These claims added another layer of controversy to a case that had already raised numerous difficult questions about justice, mercy, and the appropriate punishment for heinous crimes. For the surviving family members of Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha Clay, Byron's execution represented the end of a long wait for justice. After nearly 4 decades of appeals, stays, and legal proceedings, the man who had destroyed their family was finally held accountable with his life for the lives he had taken. But even with Byron's death, the pain of loss remained. No execution, no matter how justified, can bring back the dead or undo the trauma of violent crime. Angela would still never see her daughters grow up. LaToya would never graduate from high school or start a family of her own. Lakeisha would never experience her 7th birthday or any of the milestones that should have followed. The case of Byron Black and the Clay family murders serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that exists in some individuals and the devastating impact that domestic violence can have on innocent victims. It highlights the particular tragedy of child murder, crimes that shock our collective conscience and challenge our faith in human decency. As we reflect on this case, we remember Angela Clay as more than just a victim. She was a mother who worked hard to provide for her children, a woman who sought love and companionship, someone who deserved to live a full and peaceful life. We remember 9-year-old Latoya, bright and curious, with dreams and potential that were snuffed out far too soon. And we remember 6-year-old Lakeisha, barely past toddlerhood, whose life was ended before it had truly begun. Their story reminds us of the importance of recognizing the warning signs of domestic violence, of supporting vulnerable members of our communities, and of working to prevent such tragedies from occurring in the future. While Byron Black has paid the ultimate price for his crimes, the best memorial to Angela, Latoya, and Lakeisha Clay is a commitment to protecting others from similar fates. In the end, this case represents both the worst of human nature, the capacity for jealousy, control, and violence that led Byron Black to commit these heinous acts, and the best of our collective response to such evil through the pursuit of justice, the support of survivors, and the determination to remember and honor the victims. The Clay family murders will remain a part of Nashville's criminal history, a dark chapter in the city's story that serves as a reminder of the real human cost of violent crime. But more. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.